At 3:17 in the morning, on the 38th floor of an unfinished tower in Boston, a cleaning woman 4 months pregnant set down her bucket, pulled out a chair, and sat at a desk no engineer in that building was permitted to touch. She opened a set of structural drawings worth $400 million. She drew a metal pencil from the pocket of her uniform, its paint long worn away, and she began to work. Outside, the November wind pressed against the glass. In all 45 floors of that tower, she was the only soul awake. At least, that was what she believed. She did not know that the most powerful man in Boston was standing in the doorway behind her, and that he had been standing there for 4 minutes. He did not speak at first. He only watched her hands move across the paper, hands roughened by scrubbing floors, by carrying water, by 2 years of cleaning rooms belonging to people who had never once learned her face. Hands moving through numbers as though they belonged there, as though they had belonged there a very long time ago. Then he spoke. One question very quietly. "You're just the cleaning lady, are you?" Delaney Quinn came out of her chair. The pencil dropped, rolled once across the glass and stopped. Beneath the pale green glow of the emergency lights, 2 worn letters showed on its side. DQ. She stood too quickly. The dizziness took her. She caught the edge of the desk, and in that moment, the loose gray uniform she had deliberately requested 2 sizes too large pulled tight against her body. The man in the doorway said nothing. 3 seconds. He had just seen the thing she had spent 4 months hiding from the entire world. In the 20 seconds that followed, this woman would name the flaw that 14 of the finest engineers on the eastern seaboard had failed to find in 6 days and 6 nights. She would speak 3 sentences, and those 3 sentences would save a tower, 2,300 jobs, and $400 million. But that is not the most remarkable thing about this story, because there was a truth about the woman in the gray uniform that no one in that building knew. A truth the man behind her did not know either, not until he discovered that 4 years ago it was his own hand that had signed the check which destroyed her life. 4 years ago, Delaney Quinn did not clean floors. 4 years ago, she signed a piece of paper. She did not read it. And 3 weeks later, a bridge came down. If you believe that there are extraordinary people walking quietly past us every single day, and that not once have we truly seen them like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and come with us to the end of this story. 11 hours before Delaney Quinn placed her hand on that pencil, on the south side of the city, November rain was tapping against the tin roof of an empty warehouse standing close to the water's edge. South Boston Harbor at 4 o'clock in the afternoon had the color of wet steel. The cranes stood motionless in the fog, and the containers were stacked on top of one another, like the teeth of a broken jaw. No one worked in this section anymore. The Donnelly family had bought the entire row of warehouses 50 years earlier, and they had never sold them, and they had never used them either, and that was what frightened people most. Inside the hollow building, beneath the only light that still worked, there was a blue plastic chair and a 55-year-old man sitting on it. His name was Cormac Vale. He sold steel. No one had tied him up. No one stood guard. The roll-up door at the far end of the warehouse was wide open, wide enough for a truck to drive through. And outside was the street, and across the street was a coffee shop still bright with light, and inside that coffee shop someone was laughing. Cormac Vale sat still. He had been sitting still for 40 minutes. He didn't dare stand up, because he understood one thing the people in the coffee shop didn't understand. When Rafferty Donnelly told him to come to a place, leaving before he was allowed to leave wasn't freedom. It was an answer, and that answer would follow him for the rest of his life. The side door gave a dry creak. Rafferty Donnelly walked in, and he didn't take off his coat. The man stood nearly 6'3", with short black hair and a thin scar running along his left eyebrow that no one had ever asked about. 34 years old. He moved without making a sound on the damp concrete floor, the habit of a child raised among the docks, where any man who let others hear his footsteps had already lost before the fight began. He didn't look at Cormac Vale. He walked straight to the wooden table set in the middle of the warehouse and placed something on it. It was a piece of reinforcing steel, about the length of a man's handspan, sawed clean through. Cormac Vale looked at it and knew what was coming, because that steel bar should have been solid. It was hollow. "Do you know what this is, Cormac?" Rafferty Donnelly didn't ask. He stated it. "Rafe, let me explain. I asked if you know what this is." In the warehouse, there was only the sound of the rain. "This is the steel bar you sold me at the price of solid steel." Rafferty picked it up, turned it once between his fingers, then set it down very gently, the way a man sets down something fragile. 37 tons. Your invoice, your signature. He moved around the table. "It's on the 19th floor, Section B. Above it, 40 people work every day." Cormac Vale opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Let me tell you a story." Rafferty's voice didn't rise and didn't fall. It was as flat as the harbor water outside. "My father was a welder. His name was Fergus. He worked 42 years on construction sites in this city, and his hands were so large he couldn't hold a teacup properly. When I was 15 years old, a scaffold collapsed. My father was buried beneath 2 tons of concrete." Cormac Vale looked down at the floor. "At the funeral, a man in a gray suit came to see my mother. He was holding a leather briefcase. He told her the company was very sorry, that my father had been a good worker, and that there had been an investigation, and the conclusion was human error." Rafferty paused. Then he said one more thing. He said, "These things still happen." The rain beat harder on the tin roof. My mother stood there, in the black coat she had borrowed from her sister, and she nodded. She nodded, Cormac. She didn't know what else to do. She just nodded and thanked him. I was 15 years old, and I stood beside her, and I promised myself one thing. He bent down until he was level with the eyes of the man in the plastic chair. That no one would ever say that sentence to any woman standing before her husband's coffin because of one of my construction sites. Cormac Vale began to tremble. Not from the cold. "I'm not going to beat you." Rafferty Donnelly straightened, slowly buttoning his coat again. "I'm not going to touch you. I'll never touch you. You can tell anyone you want that, but tomorrow morning you'll pick up the phone and call every construction site you've ever worked with. And not one person will answer. Your son will submit job applications. No one will call back. You'll drive up to New Hampshire, then Rhode Island, then Vermont, and at every gate there'll be a man who looks at your papers, then looks up at your face, then shakes his head. You won't understand why. No one will tell you why." Rafferty Donnelly looked at him. "You won't be poor, Cormac. You've made enough money already. You'll simply no longer exist." Cormac Vale sat motionless for a very long time. Then Rafferty turned his back and walked toward the table, and said without looking back, "The door is over there, Cormac. It's been open from the beginning." Cormac Vale rose from the blue plastic chair. He picked up his hat. He walked across the damp concrete floor, through the roll-up door, and out into the rain. He didn't look back once. Inside the empty warehouse, the most powerful man in Boston stood alone beneath the only light still burning. He picked up the hollow steel bar once more. He turned it in his hand, looking into the black hole at the center of its core, where solid metal should have been. He stood that way for a long time. Rafferty Donnelly believed he knew everything that happened inside his buildings. He believed that was what power meant. And in exactly 11 more hours, on the 38th floor of a tower 4 kilometers from this place, he would stand in a doorway and look at the hands of a woman he had never once seen before, and he would understand that he had been wrong for 2 years. 4 kilometers to the north, while Rafferty Donnelly was still standing in the warehouse, with the hollow steel bar in his hand, the city of Boston had turned the color of evening, and at the service entrance behind the Keystone Tower, a woman stepped down from the last bus on route number 43, 9:50 at night. She walked 200 meters along the concrete slope leading down to the basement, one hand holding the collar of her coat, the other clutching a cloth bag that held a cold lunchbox, and the November wind followed her underground like an animal that wouldn't let go. Inside, beneath the fluorescent lights, the night security guard sat behind the glass counter and lifted his head from the book he was reading. He was 63 years old. His name was Otis Flanagan, and he had been sitting at that counter for 11 years. "Good evening, Miss Quinn." She stopped for half a second, as she did every night, because each time she heard those 2 words she felt something very small shift quietly inside her chest. "Good evening, Mr. Otis." Then she swiped her card and walked through. In that entire 45-story tower, Otis Flanagan was the only person who called her by name. On the payroll of the staffing company Brightline Facilities, she didn't have a name. She had a code, NS114, night shift, employee number 114. That code was printed on the timesheet, on her paycheck, on the plastic badge clipped to the breast pocket of her shirt, and in the past 2 years not a single person working inside this building had ever lowered their eyes to read it. Delaney Quinn changed into her uniform in the cramped locker room that smelled of bleach, and she put it on carefully, slowly, in a way no one on the night shift noticed. The gray shirt she was wearing was 2 sizes too large for her body. She had filled out the uniform request form herself 3 months earlier, checked the largest size, and when the supply clerk asked if she was sure, she said she liked having room to move while she worked. She was 4 months pregnant. The outsourced contract didn't include maternity leave. It also didn't contain any clause forbidding pregnant women from working, but it did have one line on page 4, written in a smaller font than the rest, stating that the company had the right to terminate the contract at any time for reasons of workplace safety, without prior notice. Delaney had read that line. She read all the lines now. She read everything. If Brightline found out, she would lose her job within 24 hours, and along with that job, she would lose the bare minimum insurance card that allowed her to go to the community clinic on Warren Street once a month. So she wore a shirt 2 sizes too large. She walked a little more slowly when she climbed the stairs. She never lifted a full bucket of water, and whenever anyone passed by, she bent over the cart as if she were rearranging the bottles. She had become very good at turning herself into something not worth looking at. That was the final skill life had taught her, and she had learned it better than anything she had ever learned at technical school. She pushed the cart into the freight elevator and pressed the button for the 38th floor. The doors slid shut, and in the dull steel, she saw the reflection of a 28-year-old woman with brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, with dark circles beneath her eyes, and with a belly that the loose, oversized gray shirt was hiding very, very well. On the 38th floor, the eastern corridor was lit. Delaney pushed the cart through the engineering office area, and she passed a desk where a young engineer had fallen asleep on his keyboard, and when he jolted awake, his elbow knocked over his cup of coffee. She knelt to wipe it up. He said thank you, without looking up, his eyes still fixed on the screen. He had sat in the 3rd row of her guest lecture class at Northeastern University in the spring, 4 years earlier, and she still remembered his name, and she still remembered that he had asked a very intelligent question about structural drag coefficients on the 2nd session. She finished wiping up the spilled coffee, wrung the cloth into the bucket, stood, and pushed the cart away. At the end of the corridor, she turned left by the habit of 700 nights, and she moved toward the area she hated most in the entire building, though she had never said that to anyone. It was the display hallway on the 40th floor, where the leadership of Donnelly Holdings hung photographs of their partners in oak frames that were polished with a special solution every Thursday. But tonight was Tuesday, and she didn't have to go up there. Tonight she only had the 38th floor, and at the end of the 38th floor, behind a glass wall that ran from floor to ceiling, there were 14 people who hadn't gone home in 6 days. People called it the war room, though no one remembered who had first called it that. It sat in the southeast corner of the 38th floor, and one of its walls was made entirely of glass, running from floor to ceiling, so anyone passing through the corridor could look inside without hearing anything. Delaney Quinn pushed her cart to about 15 steps from the door, stopped, and began cleaning that glass, because over the past 2 years, she had learned that wiping glass was the only job that allowed a person to stand still in one place for 20 minutes, without anyone asking why. Inside, 14 people were seated. She knew the number clearly, because she had counted them every night for 6 nights in a row, and every night the number was still 14. And every night their shirts were a little more wrinkled. 2 people were sleeping on armchairs in the corner of the room, with no blankets over them, their arms thrown across their faces. A young blonde woman with her hair tied high stood in front of the whiteboard, holding a marker, staring at what she had just written as if it had scolded her. 4 empty pizza boxes were stacked on the windowsill. On the large screen mounted at the front of the room was a chart. Delaney had been looking at that chart for 5 nights. It had a blue line running across it, calm and obedient, and then at some point it began to ripple, and the ripples grew larger and larger, uneven but each time higher than the one before, until they struck straight into a red horizontal line above them, and the entire drawn line changed color. She wiped more slowly. The door to the war room wasn't fully closed. It had never fully closed, because the hinge had been bent since installation, and no one had bothered to call a repairman, and through that gap, about the width of 3 knuckles, voices slipped out into the corridor, distorted but clear enough. A middle-aged man was speaking. His voice was hoarse in the way of someone who had shouted too much for too many hours. Delaney knew his name was Sullivan Reeves. Because that name was on the floor assignment sheet she had to sign every evening, and because 2 weeks earlier she had cleaned the ink stain he had spilled on the conference room carpet. He said, "It runs clean under 50. Once it passes 55, the margin doubles. Same floor." Every time, Delaney Quinn stopped the glass cloth in place. She stood very still, her hand still raised at shoulder height, the wet cloth pressed against the glass, and for the next 90 seconds she didn't move. Not because she was thinking, she already knew. She knew by the 3rd second. It wasn't wind. Wind didn't behave like that. When wind pushed a building, the building leaned and then sprang back, once, decisively, and everything faded. But the line on that screen wasn't fading, it was growing. With every cycle it received a little more energy and held on to it, and with the next cycle it received a little more, and on until it swallowed itself whole. That was resonance. That was what happened when a structure was shaken at the very frequency it naturally wanted to shake, and it no longer wanted to stop. Delaney Quinn knew that shape of death, because 4 years earlier she had spent 14 months writing the formula to prevent it. Inside the room, the blonde woman turned away from the whiteboard. The employee badge hanging from her neck read Margot Price. "Then we lower the threshold below 50, she said. "No." Sullivan Reeves stood, walked to the window, and turned his back. "The contract says the tower has to withstand winds of 120 kilometers an hour. That's city code. That's the entire occupancy permit. If it can't stand at 120, then it isn't allowed to have people inside, Margot. It isn't allowed to have one desk in it. It isn't allowed to have one human being in it. Then the foundation. We drilled 4 test holes already. The foundation is clean. Then the steel. The material certificates were independently verified. There are signatures. There are seals. There are dates." Sullivan Reeves lifted both hands and rubbed his face very slowly, from forehead to chin. "I've reread those certificates 3 times in 6 days. 3 times, Margot. They're clean." Someone in the corner of the room spoke softly, the voice almost too faint to hear. "Someone must have seen this before, somewhere." At some point, Sullivan Reeves turned back, and he answered in the voice of a man who had just realized that he no longer believed his own sentence. "No one has," he said. "We're the best people money can buy. If we don't see it, then no one sees it." Outside in the corridor, the woman in the gray shirt 2 sizes too large lowered her hand. She folded the cloth into quarters, placed it on the edge of the cart, very neatly. She stood there for 3 more seconds, looking into the glass, and in that glass she saw 14 people sitting in a brightly lit room and a red chart on the wall, and layered over all of it was the faint reflection of her own face, a face none of them had ever seen. She could open that door. It was 15 steps away from her, and its hinge was bent, and it would open very easily. She would say 3 sentences, and perhaps they would laugh, and perhaps they would call security, and by Friday morning, Brightline Facilities would receive a phone call about employee number 114, the one who had interfered with engineering work without permission, and someone would open her file to see who she was, and they would see. Delaney Quinn placed her hand on the handlebar of the cart. She pushed it toward the end of the corridor, the wheels making a soft sound over the terrazzo floor, and she said nothing at all. Night. She wasn't supposed to go up to the 40th floor, but at 11:20, the radio hanging from the side of her cart crackled, and the voice of the night shift coordinator said someone had spilled water in the display hallway, that the leadership would be in the building tomorrow morning, and that NS-114 should go up and handle it right away. So Delaney Quinn pressed the button for 40, and the freight elevator carried her up 2 more floors, and the doors opened onto a hallway paved in honey-colored stone, with oak frames on both sides hung exactly 1.2 meters apart. She had cleaned those frames every Thursday for 2 years. She knew which frame had a small scratch on the lower right corner. She knew which frame was half a centimeter out of line with the sight line, and no one had ever adjusted it. She didn't look at the photographs inside the frames. She had stopped looking in the 3rd week. She knelt beside the puddle in front of the elevator doors, and she was wringing out the cloth for the 2nd time when the executive elevator at the far end of the hallway lit up. The clock on the wall read 11:40. The doors opened. The man who stepped out didn't take off his coat. He was nearly 6'3", and he walked very fast, and he was shouting into the phone pressed against his ear. Delaney Quinn did what her body had learned to do long ago, before her mind could even make a decision. She stood up, stepped back twice, pressed her back flat against the wall between two oak frames, pulled the cart close to her body, and lowered her eyes to the stone floor. She made herself smaller. She made herself flat. She became an object with dimensions and no name. This was the skill she had spoken of, and she performed it perfectly. "I don't want to hear the word if, Hollis." The man's voice struck the glass frames on both sides and bounced back. "I want to hear the words, it's done. The city safety board lands here in 6 hours. Do you understand what happens if they walk into my tower and see a red chart?" He came toward her. Her cart was blocking part of the hallway, because she had pulled it in, but the rear wheel still stuck out about the width of a handspan. Rafferty Donnelly stepped around it. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He simply shifted his weight half a step to the left and kept going, exactly the way a man steps around a trash can set in the wrong place on a sidewalk. She was less than 1 meter from him. He didn't look. "Then find me someone else, because the 14 engineers I'm paying 7 figures a year clearly can't find it." He stopped at the office door at the end of the hallway, his hand on the doorknob, and he glanced once down the corridor, the look of a man checking whether the windows had been closed. His eyes passed over her. They passed over the gray shirt, the cart, the wet cloth in her hand. They passed over her and moved on and didn't stop for even 1,000th of a second. Then he spoke into the phone without lowering his voice, without turning away, without the slightest concern that there was a person standing 9 steps from him and hearing every word clearly, and moved the cleaning people off this floor. "I don't want any strangers around here right now." A pause. "Who?" "I don't know. The cleaning woman. Just move her." The door closed. In the hallway paved with honey-colored stone, beneath the recessed lights shining on 42 oak frames. Cleaned every Thursday, the woman stood still with the wet cloth in her hand. Water dripped from the cloth onto the stone floor, 1 drop at a time, and she hugged each one clearly. She had been called far worse names. 4 years earlier, in a conference room with 11 people she had trusted with her entire life, she had been called a liar. She had been called careless. She had been called the woman whose signature was on the final page. Compared with those words, cleaning woman was almost a compliment, but it still landed somewhere. It didn't hurt. That was the strange thing. It didn't hurt the way those other words once had. It simply settled very softly, on top of a stack of things that had settled there before, and that stack grew thicker by 1 sheet of paper. Delaney Quinn bent down. She finished wiping the puddle in front of the elevator. She wrung out the cloth, folded it into quarters, and placed it on the edge of the cart. Then she walked down the hallway and cleaned all 42 oak frames, even though tonight was Tuesday, and tonight it wasn't her job, because she was already there and because they were dusty. She cleaned the 17th frame a little more slowly than the others. She always cleaned the 17th frame a little more slowly. She didn't look at the photograph inside. Then she finished cleaning the rest of the 40th floor, every room, every hallway, until not a single speck of dust remained. She always finished the floor. It was the only thing left that she still did completely, and she did it every night, for a building that didn't know her name. The night shift at Brightline had 1 30-minute break, and employees weren't allowed to sit in areas where the chairs belonged to other people, so Delaney Quinn ate her dinner in the freight elevator lobby on the 38th floor, her back against an unfinished cement wall, seated on an overturned plastic crate. 12:30 at night. In her cloth bag was a sandwich made the evening before, the wrapper already damp, and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold into a muddy-colored liquid. She ate in small bites, slowly, because the doctor at the Warren Street clinic had told her she had to eat slowly, and because she had realized that if a person ate slowly, half a sandwich could still be enough to make them feel full. Then she took out her phone and pressed the only number saved by name in it. The other end picked up before the second ring, as it did every night. "I measured it already," Beatrice Oduya said without a greeting. "Measured it at 7 o'clock right after you walked out the door. 142/91. Don't measure it anymore. I was a nurse for 31 years, Delaney. I'll measure whatever I want." There was the sound of a kettle whistling. Beatrice was 55 years old, lived in the apartment across the hall. And 15 years earlier, she had taken the blood pressure of dying people in a hospital in Roxbury. And now she took the blood pressure of a young woman who wasn't related to her in any way. Your blood pressure is climbing. You need to rest. Only 5 more months, Bea. Silence. You've been telling me you're fine for 4 months, Delaney. She looked down at the cement floor between her feet. Go to sleep. It's late, listen to me. That building has 45 floors, and there isn't one person inside it who knows who you are. If you fall on the stairs at 2 in the morning, no one will find you until 6. I won't fall. You won't fall, Beatrice repeated slowly in the voice of someone putting a sentence away somewhere so she could take it out and use it later. Fine. Eat the rest of that sandwich. I already ate, liar. The call ended. Delaney sat for a while longer in the cold freight elevator lobby, and then she opened her faded leather wallet, and from the innermost pocket she took out a small black and white photograph. Its edges curled from being folded and unfolded too many times. She looked at it. 3 seconds. Then she folded it again and put it back in the same place, and she snapped the wallet closed, and she stood up. There were nights when she didn't take it out. She stood and pushed the cart away and thought of nothing at all, and those nights were the good nights. But tonight a man had stepped around her in the honey-colored stone hallway, and he had said one sentence into a phone, and for reasons she couldn't understand, that sentence had opened a door in her mind that she had closed very carefully. 4 months ago, at 4:40 in the morning, Wesley Quinn died over the steering wheel of a delivery truck parked along Route 6, 11 kilometers from their home. He was 31 years old. It was his 3rd shift of that day. The first shift was at the warehouse, from 6 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. The second was unloading at the harbor from 3 to 10 at night. The third was a night delivery route, and he had taken it on because they were still short $1,200 for the final installment of the lawyer's bill, and the lawyer didn't wait. Delaney received the news at 6 in the morning. She had just finished her cleaning shift at another office building, another life, and she was holding a broom in her hand when the phone vibrated, and she heard a man's voice introduce himself as a state trooper, and she held on to that broom through the entire call, and only 10 minutes after hanging up, did she realize her hand was still clenched around the handle and she couldn't open her fingers. They told her his heart had stopped for a few seconds. They told her he hadn't had time to see anything. They told her the things people always tell. In the truck cab, the police found a brown paper bag on the passenger seat. Inside the bag was a box of elephant-shaped butter cookies, the kind sold at the little bakery on the corner of Tremont, the kind Delaney had mentioned twice that whole week, and then stopped mentioning, because it was $7, and because $7 was 2 meals. The receipt in the bag said 3:58 in the morning. He had pulled over. He had turned off the engine. He had walked across the street, into the bakery that had just opened, stood in line behind a taxi driver, paid $7 in change from his coat pocket, and carried the paper bag back to the truck. He set it on the passenger seat. He started the engine. 42 minutes later, his heart stopped. That box of cookies was still in the kitchen cabinet of the apartment on Cedar Street. It sat on the second shelf, on the left behind the salt jar. In 4 months, Delaney Quinn hadn't eaten a single one. She hadn't thrown it away either. Sometimes, around 3 in the morning, after she had gone home and showered and lain down without being able to sleep, she went into the kitchen in the dark and opened that cabinet door. She stood there, her hand on the handle, and she looked at the box. Then she closed the cabinet door and went to bed, on the 38th floor of the Keystone Tower. At 1:45 in the morning, Delaney Quinn folded the wallet compartment shut and rose from the plastic crate. She picked up the cold coffee, took one swallow, grimaced, then poured the rest down the sink in the corner of the lobby. She still had 5 hours left in her night shift, and at the far end of the corridor behind the glass wall, the lights in the war room were still on. By 2:10 in the morning, the 2 people who had been sleeping in the armchairs were awake, and all 14 people in the war room were sitting with their backs straight, and no one said anything for 4 full minutes. Delaney Quinn returned to the corridor on the 38th floor to finish the final part of her night shift, and she saw that the door was still open by exactly 3 knuckles, and she saw on the large screen that same line still driving into the red threshold, the way it had been driving into it for 6 days. She took out her cloth. She began wiping the glass at the spot she had wiped 3 hours earlier, the spot that no longer had a single stain on it. Inside, Sullivan Reeves rose from his chair and struck the tabletop with his palm. The sound wasn't loud, it was only final, with the kind of finality that belongs to a man who has run out of everything left to hold on to. 4 hours, he said. In 4 hours, the City Safety Board will come up in the east elevator and walk into this room, and they'll ask me one question. They'll ask whether this tower is safe. No one moved. And if I don't have an answer, they'll seal the site this morning. Not next week, not after a meeting. This morning, he looked around the room from one face to another. 45 floors have been standing there for 3.5 years. $400 million. 2,300 people are working on Donnelly construction sites, and those 2,300 people have spouses, have children, have rent due on the 1st. Sullivan Reeves dropped heavily back into his chair. He was 38 years old, and in the past 6 days he had aged by 3 years. If the tower dies, everything dies with it. Margot Price was still standing beside the whiteboard, the marker still in her hand, but she hadn't written anything on it in 2 hours. She was 26 years old, and she was the youngest person in the room, and she was the only one who had never worked anywhere else but here. "Sully," she said. Her voice was so soft that the people sitting at the far end of the room had to tilt their heads. Someone must have seen this before. Somewhere in this world, someone, at some point, must have stood in front of this chart and known what it was. Sullivan Reeves looked up, and he answered very slowly, as if every word were heavy, as if he were listening to himself speak and didn't like what he heard. "No one has, Margot. But, no one has." He raised his hand and pointed around the room, pointing at each person in turn. "Look around. 4 of the top engineering schools in America, 2 doctorates. 97 years of combined experience. This building hired us because we're the best people money can buy." He lowered his hand. "If we don't see it, then no one sees it." Inside the room, someone exhaled. Sullivan Reeves reached for the coat draped over the back of his chair. "Go home, all of you. Sleep for 2 hours. Be here at 6. They filed out, one by one. They left the way people leave a hospital room, without speaking, without looking at one another, hands in their pockets. The first person stepped past the cart. The third shifted aside to avoid the glass mop leaning against the wall. Margot Price passed so close to Delaney that her elbow almost touched the shoulder of the woman in gray, and she murmured an apology, and she didn't lift her head, and she kept walking. Sullivan Reeves was the last to leave. He turned off the lights in the war room, pulled the door shut, and that door with its bent hinge didn't close fully. It sprang back open by 3 knuckles as it always did. He didn't notice. He walked straight to the elevator without looking back. For 18 seconds, the corridor on the 38th floor became completely still. The only light left spilled out from the gap in the war room door, where the large screen was still glowing, where the red line still drove into the threshold line again and again, tireless in the dark. 15 steps away, a woman 4 months pregnant stood very, very still. Her hand was still raised at shoulder height. The cloth was still pressed to the glass. She didn't wipe. She didn't lower her hand. She stood that way for a length of time that later she wouldn't be able to say. Down below, in the underground parking garage, Sullivan Reeves sat in his car and didn't start the engine. He sat in the darkness, both hands on the steering wheel, and stared at the concrete wall in front of him. 2:30 in the morning. Then he took out his phone and called a number he had never called at this hour. In the 4 years he had worked under that man. It rang once. Reeves. The voice on the other end carried no trace of sleep. "Mr. Donnelly." Sullivan Reeves closed his eyes. "I'm calling to tell you first. Because I don't think you should hear this for the first time in a room with the city board sitting there." Silence on the other end of the line. Not even a breath. "Tomorrow morning, I have to tell them that we don't know." Sullivan Reeves opened his eyes and looked at the concrete wall. 6 days. 14 people. And we don't know why your tower is shaking. He waited for shouting. He had prepared himself for shouting. But what he heard was only a long silence and then the rustle of fabric, the sound of a coat being lifted from the back of a chair. "I'm coming," Rafferty Donnelly said. And he hung up. The corridor on the 38th floor was dark and silent, and the woman standing in the middle of it began to do a calculation. She did it the way she had been taught 15 years earlier, placing the quantities on both sides, allowing no emotion to enter any variable. The first side, If she pushed that door open and sat down in Sullivan Reeves's chair, she would lose her job. Not might lose it, would lose it. In this entire tower there were 311 cameras, and she knew the position of every single one because she cleaned their plastic casings on even-numbered weeks. The camera in the corner of this hallway ceiling looked straight at the war room door. It recorded continuously. It had a red indicator light, and that light was on. Along with the job, she would lose the minimum insurance card Brightline issued to full-time employees. And along with that card, she would lose the checkup in week 26, the checkup the doctor at the Warren Street Clinic had told her again and again she mustn't miss, because of her blood pressure, because of her age, because of 4 years of not eating enough. And there was one more thing. That door was locked by a key card, and Delaney Quinn didn't have a key card to open it, and in her shirt pocket she had an unmarked gray plastic card that Otis Flanagan had quietly given her 14 months earlier, when she said that sometimes she needed to get into the mechanical room to replace the air conditioner filter core and had to wait 40 minutes for someone to come down and open the door. He gave it to her and said, "Don't lose it, and don't tell anyone." If they reviewed the door log, they would see the code of that card, and a 63-year-old man who had sat behind that glass counter for 11 years would lose his job before she lost hers. The second side had only one line. The 14 people in that room, after the city board sealed the project, would carry a name for the rest of their lives. The engineering team that brought down the Keystone Tower. Not brought down in the literal sense. People wouldn't need it to collapse. All it would take was one sheet of paper saying it wasn't safe enough for occupancy, and 45 floors of steel would stand there empty for years like a monument. And every time one of those 14 people applied for a job anywhere in America, someone would type their name into a search box, and someone would pick up the phone and say she's very good. But there was something in Boston, don't say I told you. Delaney Quinn knew exactly how that happened. She knew because she had submitted 147 applications in the first 3 years. She had counted. And somewhere very deep beneath both sides of the calculation, something else was turning over. When Delaney was 13, her mother fell on a fire escape step behind the packing plant in Lowell. A step that had been written into the repair log 6 months earlier and that no one had fixed. She never walked again. Delaney heard the news at school, in the middle of math class, when her homeroom teacher knocked on the door and called her name into the hallway. Nadine Quinn lost her job, lost her insurance, and lost even the ability to rise from a chair without someone helping her. The company sent a lawyer. He sat in their living room, set his leather briefcase on his knees, and said a sentence to the two of them that Delaney Quinn would never forget for the rest of her life. She was 13 years old, and she stood beside her mother's chair, and she didn't fully understand what those words meant. But she understood the voice that spoke them, the voice of a man who believed the matter was finished and he could go home for dinner. 9 years later, Delaney Quinn graduated in structural engineering from Northeastern, and she didn't choose design, and she didn't choose construction, because both paid more. She chose inspection. She chose the profession whose only work was to read and compare and sign her name in the place that said this stair step isn't safe and make someone listen. And there was one sentence she didn't allow herself to think all the way into words, because she had practiced not thinking it for 4 years, because it was the only thing that could break her. Last time she had sat still. Last time she had been too tired to read. In the dark corridor, the woman lowered her hand. She bent forward and she set the glass cleaner bottle on the top of the cart, very softly, with both hands. The way people set down an object when they know that the next time they pick it up, the hand lifting it will no longer belong to the same person. Then she reached into the breast pocket of her shirt and took out a metal mechanical pencil whose paint had worn away. She held it in her palm, and she stood there for a very long time. 3:16 in the morning. Delaney Quinn walked 15 steps, pressed the gray plastic card to the lock, and stepped into the forbidden war room. This was the exact moment our story began. Sitting at the desk no engineer dared touch, she spread out the $400 million drawings and began to work with her worn mechanical pencil. She was so absorbed that she never noticed Rafferty Donnelly standing in the doorway behind her. When his quiet question broke the silence, "You're just the cleaning lady, are you?" Delaney bolted upright, The pencil slipped from her hand, rolling across the glass table to reveal the faded initials, DQ. But as she stood, a sudden wave of dizziness hit her. She caught the edge of the desk for support, and that sudden movement pulled her oversized gray shirt tight against her body, instantly exposing the 4-month pregnancy she had fought so hard to hide. For 3 agonizing seconds, Rafferty stared at her. Then, his voice flat and cold, he lifted his hand to his radio. "Kearney, come up to the 38th floor, I'll leave," Delaney said, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "You don't need to call security, I'll hand in my badge. But before you call the police, look at the 3rd line on these drawings." Rafferty paused, then stepped forward. He bent over the scrap paper where she had just scribbled a formula in pencil. Beneath the complex symbols, a single number caught his eye, 4.2. He froze, remembering the exact same number he had seen on the vibration meter downstairs just 30 minutes ago. "Kearney," Rafferty pressed the radio button again, his eyes glued to the paper. "Go back down," he straightened, turning his full attention to the pregnant woman in the gray uniform. "You're coming with me," he said. The construction elevator was a steel cage with wire mesh, and it ran along the outside of the tower, and as it descended past the 35th floor, the whole city of Boston appeared below them, wet and golden and spread all the way to the edge of the sea. No one said anything during those 40 seconds. Delaney Quinn stood against the mesh wall, one hand gripping the rail, and looked down at the streetlights. 3:30 in the morning. The cage door opened on the 32nd floor, and the wind rushed in like a slap. There was no glass here yet. Here there was only concrete floor, red-brown primed steel columns standing in rows, and a system of diagonal bracing running across the spaces between them. 32 floors below, trucks moving along the highway gave off a distant humming sound. Rafferty Donnelly walked out into the middle of the floor, went to the 4th column from the edge, and placed his palm on it. "My father was a welder," he said. He didn't turn back to look at her. He worked on construction sites like this for 42 years, and he told me that before I believed any piece of paper, any drawing, any person, I should put my hand on the column first. The wind slipped through the steel frame and gave out a very low hum. He said steel knows how to talk. It just talks very softly. He turned his head. 30 minutes ago, I stood right here, and I put my hand here, and I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what it was. I never knew. I only knew it was wrong. He stepped aside. "Put your hand here." Delaney Quinn stood at the edge of the floor, her hair torn loose from its tie by the wind, the 2 loose flaps of her oversized gray shirt striking against each other. She walked forward. She walked slowly, one hand supporting the underside of her belly, in the way a woman 4 months pregnant moves across wet concrete. She stopped in front of the column. She looked at it. Then she pulled the rubber glove off her right hand, and she placed her bare palm against the freezing layer of primer. She closed her eyes. Rafferty Donnelly stood 1 meter away and watched her, and he said nothing at all, and the wind howled through 32 floors of bare steel. The woman stood motionless for 11 seconds. 4.2 hertz, she said. She didn't open her eyes. It's vibrating at 4.2 hertz, and the natural frequency of this bracing cluster is 4.19. Rafferty Donnelly didn't move. "Those 2 numbers are too close," she said. "They're so close that every time the wind pushes the building, this column doesn't have time to give the energy back before it gets pushed again. And it keeps a little, then a little more, then a little more." She opened her eyes. She looked straight at the most powerful man in Boston, and there was nothing on her face, no fear, no pride, no pleading. "You don't need to believe me, Mr. Donnelly." Her hand was still on the column. "You only need to believe the column." The steel cage brought them back to the 38th floor at 3:43, and Rafferty Donnelly opened the war room door with his own card, and he pulled out Sullivan Reeves's chair and didn't sit down. He stood beside it. "Sit," he said. Delaney Quinn sat down. She drew the scrap paper toward herself, turned it over to the blank side, picked up the metal mechanical pencil, and for the next 6 minutes she didn't say a single word. The man stood 2 steps away, both hands in the pockets of his coat, watching the pencil tip move. She didn't draw the building. She drew 3 rectangles, 1 curve, and a string of symbols he couldn't read. Then she set the pencil down. "Do you want the easy part first or the hard part?" "The true part." She nodded. She turned the paper around for him to see, though she knew he didn't understand it, and maybe she wasn't turning it for him. "Your tower isn't missing anything," she said. "That's the first thing you need to know." No one cut anything out here. At the top of this building on the 40th floor, there are two tuned mass dampers. They were installed from the earliest days, exactly according to design. They weigh nearly 300 tons. Rafferty Donnelly frowned. I know they're there. I signed the invoice, yes, she said. She said the word very softly, and she went on immediately, without stopping. A tuned mass damper is a weight suspended on springs. When the building leans left, the weight lags behind by 1 beat and pulls back to the right. It eats the energy of the wind. It keeps the building still. But to do that, it has to be tuned to the right frequency. A weight tuned to the wrong frequency isn't useless. It's worse than useless. It pushes in the same direction as the wind. She placed the pencil tip on the first rectangle. They tuned these two units according to wind model, 5018, 3.5 years ago. That model was accurate at the time. She moved the pencil tip to the left side of the paper and drew a fourth rectangle, standing at a distance from the other three. But 14 months ago, they finished building a 41-story office building to the northwest, 100 meters from this tower. I walk past it every night to catch the bus. She looked up. Wind doesn't pass straight through two buildings standing beside each other. It gets squeezed between them, then breaks loose into vortices behind them. Those vortices peel away from the edge of the building in a steady rhythm, like someone tapping a finger on a table. And that rhythm, at a wind speed of 55 kilometers an hour, falls right at 4.2. Rafferty Donnelly didn't move. 4.19, he said. Yes, she picked up the pencil and wrote one string of numbers in the lower corner of the paper, then another, then another. The compensation mass needed for each unit, calculated in tons, down to 2 decimal places. The spring stiffness that needed adjusting, the damping coefficient. She wrote them in small, even letters, slanting slightly to the right. The kind of handwriting a person only gets after years of making notes on drawings under construction lights. You don't lack dampers, she said. You have 2 of them. And both of them are singing the wrong note. In the war room, the red line on the large screen was still driving into the threshold line again and again in silence. Rafferty Donnelly looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked up, and the question he asked wasn't the question she had been waiting for. She had prepared for the question of who she was. She had prepared for the question of how she knew. Why did 14 people sit in this room for 6 straight days, he said. And not one of them went up to the 40th floor to look at those 2 300-ton weights. Delaney Quinn set the pencil down on the glass table. It rolled half a turn, then stopped. Because there's a piece of paper saying they were calibrated, she said. Rafferty Donnelly stood still. What piece of paper? The damper acceptance certificate. It's in the as-built file. It says both units were installed. The transport pins were removed. They were calibrated according to the wind model, and they were load tested. It has the seal of an independent inspection agency. She looked down at her 2 hands resting on the table. Mr. Reeves told them tonight that he had read that paper 3 times in 6 days. I heard him. He read it 3 times and it was clean all 3 times. Then the paper is wrong. I don't know whether the paper is wrong. She looked up and met his eyes. I only know that no one has opened the mechanical chamber cover and looked. Rafferty Donnelly stood motionless in the middle of the room, and for those 4 seconds, he didn't think about the tower. He thought about a hollow reinforcing bar lying on a wooden table in a warehouse at South Boston Harbor, and about an invoice with Cormac Vale's signature beneath it, and about the fact that he himself had signed off on that shipment without opening a single crate to look inside. He said nothing at all. But something had just shifted inside his chest, very quietly, and it would never settle back into its old place again. Then do it, Rafferty Donnelly said. He pulled the second chair out from the table and pushed it toward her with the tip of his shoe. You have 3 hours. Tell me whatever you need. I'll call someone up to open the mechanical chamber. Call someone to bring the original drawings. Call anyone you want to call. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the City Safety Board walks into this room, and I want a recalibration design lying on the table. Delaney Quinn didn't pick up the pencil. No, she said. The most powerful man in Boston turned his head. In 10 years, perhaps 3 people had said that word to him, and none of the 3 had said it this way. Not in the calm voice of someone answering a question about the weather. What did you just say? I said no. She placed both hands on the glass tabletop. You want me to sit here until 6 o'clock in the morning and produce a complete design? With calculations, with drawings, with everything. I can do it. I can finish it in 2.5 hours. Then do it. And what happens next, Mr. Donnelly? She looked up. At 6 o'clock in the morning, 14 people walk out of the elevator after 2 hours of sleep on someone else's sofa. They come into this room, and on their table is a design they've never seen, solving a problem they don't understand, signed by a person they don't know. Rafferty Donnelly said nothing. And 40 minutes after that, the City Safety Board sits down across from them and asks the first question. The first question is always the easy one. It is, please explain to us why this number is 2.4 tons and not 2.6. She looked down at the scrap paper. And Mr. Reeves will open his mouth, and nothing will come out of it. In the war room, there was only the quiet sound of the projector running. People will look at him, Delaney Quinn said. Then they'll write it into the record. And 3 months from now, when he applies for a job somewhere else, someone will pick up the phone. She said that sentence very slowly, and she said it like a person reading back a line she knew by heart. I won't do that to the 14 people in this room. Rafferty Donnelly looked at her for a long time. Then he asked, and his voice had changed, though he himself hadn't realized it yet. Then what are you going to do? Delaney Quinn pulled a blank sheet from the stack of printer paper beside the computer. She picked up the metal mechanical pencil, and she wrote. She wrote slowly, weighing every word, and she stopped twice and crossed out a line and wrote it again. When she was done, she read it from the beginning, and she looked at the final line for a long time, and there was a moment when she lifted the pencil tip as if she meant to cross it out. Then she left it there. There were 7 lines on the paper, not wind, not the foundation. It is resonance at the transfer node on the 32nd floor. The 2 dampers on the 40th floor are calibrated to the wrong frequency, because the wind model doesn't account for the new building to the northwest. The calibration parameters are on the back of this page. Verify them again from the beginning. Don't trust me. You're good engineers. You've simply never seen this sickness before, because you grew up in a world where the cure for it already existed. A friend. She folded the paper in half, very flat, running her finger along the crease. She placed it in the exact center of the table, directly beneath the large screen, where Sullivan Reeves could not possibly miss it when he sat down. Then she stood up. She pushed the chair back into its old position, close to the edge of the table, as neat as it had been before. She picked up her rubber gloves and slipped them into her pocket. She walked to the door. Rafferty Donnelly was standing in her way. He was a head taller than she was, and he didn't move. Your name, he said. Delaney Quinn stopped in front of him. She looked at the center of his chest, not up at his face. On the payroll, I'm NS-114. I didn't ask for your code. Outside the window, to the east, the sky over the bay was still pitch black. A little after 4 in the morning, she lifted her head, and for 2 seconds, the man looked straight into the eyes of the woman he had walked past 100 times in 2 years, and he didn't find there any of the things he was used to seeing in the eyes of people standing before him. No fear, no calculation, none of the small light of someone waiting to receive something, only an old exhaustion, and beneath it, very deep, something as hard as cold steel. Would you move aside? She said. Rafferty Donnelly stepped to the side. She passed him. He heard the wheels of the cart rolling farther away over the terrazzo floor, slow and steady, then the freight elevator doors closing, then nothing at all. He stood alone in the war room beneath the red light of the screen. Then he walked to the table, picked up the folded paper, and opened it. He read the 7 lines. He turned it over and looked at the strings of numbers. And then his eyes stopped at the lower right corner, where there was a line of writing smaller than all the others, written like a last-minute note, meant for whoever knew where to look. Reference, Quinn Standard, Section 4.3, 7 minutes to 6. The east elevator opened, and 14 people entered the corridor on the 38th floor in a single file, no one speaking, hair still damp, coffee in hand. Sullivan Reeves walked first. He had slept 2 hours on his younger brother's sofa, and he had woken at 4:30 to sit there composing in his head the sentence he would say to the City Safety Board, and he had composed it 30 times, and not once did it become any less terrible. He opened the war room door and turned on the lights. Then he stopped short. Rafferty Donnelly was standing at the end of the room, his back to the door, looking through the glass toward the bay. He was still wearing the black wool coat from the night before. In his hand was a folded sheet of paper. Mr. Donnelly. Sullivan Reeves froze in the doorway. When did you get here? Rafferty Donnelly didn't turn around. He only said, "Sit down, Reeves." All 14 of you, they sat. No one understood what was happening, and no one dared ask. Margot Price pulled out her chair and sat facing the large screen, and she set her coffee cup down, and she saw the white sheet of paper lying in the exact center of the table. It was folded in half, the crease pressed very flat. It hadn't been there when they left the room at 2:15. "What's this?" she said. No one answered. Margot picked it up. She opened it. She read the first line, and her back straightened. She read to the third line, and she lifted one hand to cover her mouth. "Sully." Her voice sounded very strange. Sully read this. Sullivan Reeves stood, walked around the table, and bent over behind her shoulder to read. He read all 7 lines. Then he read them a second time. Then he turned the paper over and saw the strings of numbers written in pencil, the handwriting small, even, slanting slightly to the right, and he stopped breathing. He truly stopped breathing. Margot Price heard him hold it in. "The bracing cluster on the 32nd floor," Sullivan Reeves said, and his voice broke in the middle. "The new building to the northwest. God, God. The new building to the northwest." He straightened and turned in a circle, his hands gripping his head. "It was completed 14 months ago. Our wind model was built 3.5 years ago. We never ran it again. Not one person in this room ever thought of running it again. And the 2 dampers," an engineer at the end of the table said. He stood up. "We haven't gone up to the 40th floor once in 6 days. We didn't need to go up," Sullivan Reeves said. He said it like a man defending himself for the last time, before he stopped defending himself. "We had the acceptance certificate. I read it 3 times. He dropped heavily into his chair. "I read that piece of paper 3 times. Margot Price wasn't listening. She was looking at the lower right corner on the back of the paper, at the line of writing smaller than all the others. She pulled the keyboard toward herself. She typed 3 words, Quinn Standard. On the large screen, the red chart vanished, and in its place appeared a technical document page that everyone in that room had seen thousands of times in their lives. A page they cited in every report, a page their calculation software ran on top of. Section 4.3. Method for identifying and eliminating resonance caused by aerodynamic vortices between adjacent structures. Margot Price dragged the mouse to the top of the page. There, beneath the title, was a line listing the author. She read it a second time. Then she pushed her chair back from the table, and she stood up too fast, and her face went as white as the paper in Sullivan Reeves's hand. "Sully, what, Sully, look." He looked up, the whole room looked up. On the screen, 3 meters high, there was a name, Delaney Quinn. "This standard," Margot Price said. Her voice was very small. "The standard we use every day to calculate resonance. The standard inside the software I open at 9 o'clock every morning, and have opened every day for 4 years." She swallowed. "The person who wrote it is named Delaney Quinn." No one said anything. "I know that name," Margot said. "Anyone who studied structures on the East Coast in the past 15 years knows that name. She was the lead inspector at Harrow and Vale. She wrote Section 4.3 when she was only 24. She stopped. Then she disappeared. 4 years ago, after the Riverside Bridge case, at the end of the room, with his back turned to all of them, Rafferty Donnelly opened the folded paper in his hand once more. He had read it 10 times since that woman left. This was the 11th, and his eyes stopped, as they had the 10 times before, on one exact line. "You're good engineers." He thought of a hallway paved in honey-colored stone. He thought of the sentence he had spoken into the phone at 11:40 the night before, without bothering to lower his voice, with someone standing 9 steps away from him. And he thought of the fact that this woman had used her last minutes in this room, knowing she was about to lose everything, to write a line of praise for 14 people who had never once known her name. Rafferty Donnelly walked to the computer in the corner of the room. He typed the administrator password. He opened the outsourced staffing list for Brightline Facilities. Night shift, the Keystone Tower, and he scrolled down. Number 114. Beside it was a name. The most powerful man in Boston stood looking at the screen for 8 seconds. Then he pulled out the nearest chair and sat down, slowly, like a man whose bones had just been taken out of both legs. And for the first time in 10 years, Rafferty Donnelly didn't know what he was supposed to do next. The community clinic on Warren Street opened at 7 in the morning, and by 7:15, every chair was taken. Delaney Quinn got off the bus at 7:40, still wearing the gray sweater she had pulled over her uniform for the ride. and she sat down on the concrete steps outside with 6 other people until someone inside stood up. She had been awake for 23 hours. Inside, the floor was covered in beige vinyl, faded flu shot posters from last winter hung on the walls, and there was a flickering light bulb in the ceiling that no one had bothered to replace. 19 people sat waiting. An old woman held a plastic bag full of medicine. A young man slept with his head tipped toward his shoulder. 2 children sat drawing on an old newspaper at their mother's feet, giggling together over some picture. Delaney sat in the 3rd row, both hands resting on her lap, and looked at the electronic board hanging above the clinic door. On it was a red number, 38. In her hand was a thermal printed slip whose edge had begun to curl. On that printed slip was one number, 41. The door opened. A young nurse stepped out with a folder clipped in her hand, looked down and called, 39. The sleeping man startled awake and went in. The door closed. 7 minutes later, it opened again. 40. The old woman with the plastic bag braced both hands on her knees and stood very slowly. Delaney Quinn sat still in the 3rd row and looked down at the thermal printed slip in her palm. The nurse didn't read names. Not because she was rude. She was 23 years old and worked 11 hours a day and had 70 patients on the list. And the fastest way was to call the number. No one here complained. For 4 years, no one had called Delaney Quinn by name. In the tower, she was employee number 114. On her paycheck, she was employee number 114. Here, the living thing growing beneath the 2 hands resting on her lap, the thing whose heart beat 140 times a minute, the thing the doctor said was already about 15 centimeters long from head to heel, also had only one name in the entire healthcare system of Massachusetts. Patient number 41. The phone in her pocket vibrated. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. An unfamiliar string of numbers. No saved name. Delaney Quinn looked at that number through 4 rings, and in those 4 rings she lived through everything she had imagined for the past 2 years, every time she pressed the gray plastic card against a lock she had no right to open. This was the call. Brightline would say there had been a complaint from the client. Or security would say they had reviewed the footage from the night of November 7th. Or, worst of all, it would be a calm voice introducing itself as a lawyer, and the word that voice used would be trespassing. And after that word there would be other words, and she had already heard all those words once in her life. She stood, walked out into the hallway, and answered, "Hello, Miss Quinn." Delaney stopped in the middle of the hallway. "This is Rafferty Donnelly." She closed her eyes. She leaned her back against the beige painted wall, and she felt the hallway tilt a little, and she reached one hand behind her, looking for something to hold on to. 30 seconds earlier, she had been a woman waiting for her medical appointment. Now she was a woman who had walked all the way to the end of the road and arrived at the place she had always known she would reach. "Yes," she said. Her voice was very calm. That surprised her. "I'll bring the keycard back this morning. I'll leave it at the front desk in an envelope with your name on it. I'll sign any paperwork you need me to sign." The other end was silent. "There's one more thing," she said, and now her voice changed. Now it grew a little faster, a little urgent. "That card wasn't mine, but don't fire Mr. Otis Flanagan. He's 63 years old. He has sat at that desk for 11 years, and he gave it to me because he thought I needed to get into the mechanical room to replace the air conditioner filter core. He doesn't know anything. He never knew anything. If you need someone to be responsible, that person is me, and I'll put it in writing, and I'll sign my name, and I won't sue anyone." She stopped. She heard her own breathing. On the other end, the man said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "I didn't call to fire anyone." Delaney Quinn opened her eyes. She looked at the opposite wall, where the faded flu shot poster hung, and she didn't understand. From the clinic room, the nurse's voice carried into the hallway. 41. Delaney didn't move. On the phone, the silence stretched again, longer than before, long enough for her to hear an elevator in the background behind the man, to hear someone call his name, and to hear him not answer. Then Rafferty Donnelly said, "I called to ask whether you've had breakfast." At 11 in the morning, the executive elevator stopped on the 40th floor, and the doors opened, and Delaney Quinn didn't step out right away. She was wearing the cleanest dark blue sweater she owned, the one she saved for prenatal appointments, and beneath it were loose fabric pants and a pair of sneakers whose left heel was more worn down than the right. She had walked 2 blocks from the bus stop. She kept one hand resting lightly beneath her belly, out of a habit she no longer noticed. The honey-colored stone hallway stretched out before her, and at the end of the hallway was the large conference room with the glass wall. And inside that glass wall, 15 people were standing. No one was sitting. Delaney stepped out of the elevator and walked 7 steps, and then she stopped at the doorway. 15 faces turned toward her, and she couldn't make herself go in. It wasn't fear. She would want to explain that to someone later, but she would never find the right word. 2 years of being a piece of furniture did something to a person, something very deep beneath thought itself. Her body had learned that when eyes turned toward her, she was supposed to look down, that she was supposed to step back against the wall, that she was supposed to make herself smaller, make herself flat, and become an object with dimensions and no name. Her foot wouldn't lift. Inside the room, a young blonde woman with her hair tied high set down her coffee cup. Margot Price walked around the head of the table, crossed the carpet, and stopped in front of her. She didn't say anything at all. She only held out her hand. Delaney Quinn looked at that hand. Then she took it, and she stepped into the room. Rafferty Donnelly stood at the far end of the conference table, and he waited for her to sit down, and then he said, not loudly, but loudly enough that no one in that room could pretend they hadn't heard him, "This is Miss Delaney Quinn." He looked around the table, from one face to another, the 13 faces of the 13 engineers on his payroll. Over the past 7 days, 13 people in this room have used her formula. Some of you use it every day. Some of you use it every hour. He placed both hands on the back of a chair, and none of you knew she was still walking through this building. Sullivan Reeves sat down very slowly, as if his legs could no longer hold him. Delaney Quinn told the story, for the first time in 4 years. She told it in an even voice, one that didn't rise and didn't fall, the voice of someone reading a report about somebody else. Riverside pedestrian overpass. 140 meters across the highway, connecting the eastern residential neighborhood to the park on the other side. She was the lead inspection officer. 3 weeks before the scheduled opening, during construction on the middle span, part of the support structure collapsed onto the scaffolding below. 3 workers were injured. No one died. Samples of the steel were cut out and taken for analysis, and among the 37 reinforcing bars taken from that section, 11 had hollow cores. They had been manufactured hollow. They had been sold at the price of solid steel. "I signed the final approval," Delaney Quinn said. The room stopped. No one forged my signature. No one tricked me into signing a blank sheet and then filled in the top afterward. I held the pen, and I signed. Not one person moved. 2 o'clock in the morning, she said. The 11th straight week of work, without a single Sunday off. I was sitting in the site office container, and I couldn't remember what day it was. My mentor walked in. He put the material report folder on my desk. He said, "I checked it 3 times, Dell. Sign it and go home to sleep." She stopped. I called him Uncle Thad. He came to my wedding. She looked down at her 2 hands resting on the wooden tabletop. 2 hands with nails cut short and a strange callus on the right index finger. The report was 13 pages long. I had read those 13 pages hundreds of times in my life. I knew exactly what was written on which page. That night, I signed the final page, and I didn't turn over a single sheet. In the conference room on the 40th floor, no one breathed. 3 weeks later, the bridge collapsed. Delaney Quinn lifted her head. The worker lying closest to it was named Elias Ward. He was 24 years old. He worked the day shift to pay for night classes. He can't walk anymore. Margot Price turned her face away. She lifted the back of her hand to her eyes and kept it there. "They didn't prosecute me," Delaney said. "They didn't want a trial. A trial meant opening the files, and opening the files meant someone would have to sit down and read every page one by one, and no one wanted that. So they did it more cleanly. I signed an agreement. I stayed silent. My professional license was suspended. And then there were phone calls, the kind people make to one another when they say she's very good. But there was something at Riverside. Don't say I told you." She looked straight at the man standing at the far end of the table. "Mr. Donnelly, you brought me up into this room and told 13 people they use my formula. I suppose that somewhere in your mind, you're thinking about giving something back to me. My name. My honor. A piece of paper saying people were wrong." She shook her head, very slightly. "But you're misunderstanding this. You all keep thinking I want to be cleared." Her hand closed, then opened again. "I'm not innocent, Mr. Donnelly." she said the next sentence very slowly, and she looked straight ahead, and she didn't allow her eyes to leave his. I'm the person who didn't read. For the past 4 years, Delaney Quinn had never spoken those 3 words in front of a stranger, and now she had said them, and now those 3 words were lying in the middle of the room like an object with weight. Riverside Pedestrian Overpass. At the far end of the conference table, Rafferty Donnelly stood up. He stood too quickly, and the leather chair behind him slid back across the carpet and struck the leg of a filing cabinet. No one understood what was happening. He walked to the window and stood there, both hands braced on the sill, his back to the entire room, and he said nothing. Delaney looked at that back. She had sat in enough rooms with people turning their backs on her to know that it never signaled anything good. At the corner of the table, 2 seats away from Sullivan Reeves, sat a short-haired, silver-haired woman in a charcoal suit, about 50 years old, who had been silent from the beginning of the meeting and had been writing notes in a leather notebook. She was Hollis Brennan, General Counsel of Donnelly Holdings, and she hadn't said a single word in 40 minutes. Now she set her pen down. Her face had gone white. Rafferty, she said. He didn't turn around. I know, Hollis Brennan said. I knew from the second she said the name of the bridge. I've been sitting here for 40 minutes, and I stayed silent. She drew a breath. I stayed silent because I was calculating. I was calculating how much you would lose if I said it out loud. Rafferty Donnelly was still looking out through the glass, down at the city of Boston, down at the stream of traffic moving along the avenue below. Have you calculated it? He asked. Yes, how much? Hollis Brennan looked down at her closed leather notebook. Everything, she said. Rafferty Donnelly stood there for 3 more seconds. Then he turned back. And the voice that came from that man was as dry as cement before water, and there wasn't a trace in it of the man who had asked her whether she had eaten breakfast at 8:20 that morning. The developer of the Riverside Overpass, he said, was a trust called Harrow Bay Trust. Delaney Quinn sat motionless. She knew that name. It had been on the second line of the contract she signed that year. It had been on the heading of every document sent to the site office container at the construction site. It was a name without a face, one of hundreds of investment trusts along the East Coast, and in 4 years she had not once thought about it, because people don't think about a name with no face. It was a blind trust, Rafferty Donnelly said. Lawyers were listed as the named party, 3 layers of intermediary companies. There was no Donnelly name anywhere on any public piece of paper. I wasn't the one who created it. My father created it. He left me 40 trusts like that, and I inherited them when I was 24. He took 1 step toward the table. I never read 1 page of Harrow Bay Trust's reports. Not 1 page. In 8 years, he looked straight at her. I signed checks. In the conference room on the 40th floor. There was the sound of someone setting a coffee cup down too hard on the tabletop. When that bridge collapsed, Rafferty Donnelly said, the trust's lawyer called me. He said there had been an incident, that it had been contained, that the cause had been identified, and he gave me a name. He stopped. That name was Delaney Quinn. No one in the room moved. I heard that name exactly once in my life. I told him to handle it, and I hung up, and I never asked about it again. I didn't ask who you were. I didn't ask how old you were. I didn't ask whether you had a family. I didn't ask whether anyone had checked to see if that name was truly the name that should bear responsibility. Rafferty Donnelly stood in the middle of the largest room in his building. I destroyed you 4 years ago by not looking, he went on, and his voice didn't tremble at all, and that was the worst part. Then for the past 2 years, I walked past you every night in this building, and I still didn't look. Delaney Quinn stood up. She stood slowly, 1 hand braced on the tabletop, and that hand was trembling hard, and she didn't try to hide it. Then, she said, she had to stop. She drew in a short, broken breath. Then the baby in my belly is the child of a man who died because he was working 3 jobs in a single day. In the room, Margot Price raised both hands to cover her mouth. He took the 3rd shift, Delaney said, to pay the last $1,200 of the lingering debt for my lawyer. She looked at Rafferty Donnelly. And the lawyer on the other side, the one who sat across from us for 14 months, the one who offered that silence agreement, was paid with your money. She picked up her sweater from the back of the chair. She walked to the door. No one stopped her. He caught up with her in the ground floor's lobby, between the granite columns and the green potted plants whose leaves she had wiped for 2 years. He didn't say anything. He only held out a filled-in check, the signature still wet. Delaney Quinn looked at the check. She didn't look at the number. Later, when someone asked her how much that number was, she would tell the truth and say she didn't know. She took it, tore it in half, and placed the two halves on the stone reception counter. "Do you know what they gave me 4 years ago?" she said. Rafferty Donnelly stood still. "A check. In exchange for my signature on a 19-page silence agreement." She pushed the two halves of paper toward him with her fingertips. "And I signed it. Because Wesley needed money for medicine, and I needed money for a lawyer, and I was too tired." She looked up. "I've signed twice in my life without reading, Mr. Donnelly." She buttoned her sweater. "This is the third time, and this time I've read it." Delaney Quinn walked out of the Keystone Tower through the glass revolving door she had never been allowed to use in 2 years of working there. Outside, it was raining. For the next 9 days, she didn't say a single word to him. Delaney Quinn got back to the apartment on Cedar Street at nearly 1 in the afternoon, and she didn't take off her coat, and she didn't turn on the lights. She stood in the middle of the small kitchen for a long time, her keys still in her hand, looking at the dripping faucet she had meant to fix since August. Then her knees softened, and she sat down on the vinyl floor, her back against the refrigerator door, both legs stretched out in front of her like a child. She sat there all afternoon. The light through the window shifted from gray to pale gold, and then to a leaden color, and the rain kept falling on the front steps outside, and the faucet kept dripping. She didn't cry. She didn't think in any clear order. There was only one sentence in her head, repeating itself, not moving forward, not moving back, only turning in place. Those 4 years had happened because one man signed a check without reading. At 7 in the evening, there was a knock at the door. Delaney didn't get up. The knock came again, and then there was the sound of a key, because Beatrice Oduya had kept a spare key for 3 years, and had never used it, and now she used it. She stood in the kitchen doorway, 55 years old, wearing a wine-colored wool robe, and she looked down at the woman sitting on the floor. She didn't ask what had happened. She walked in, set her handbag on the table, opened the cabinet to take out the kettle, poured in water, and turned on the stove. She did those things slowly, without looking at Delaney, the way a nurse works in the sick room of someone who cannot bear one more question. When the kettle began to whistle, she turned off the stove. Then she turned back, opened her handbag, and took out an envelope. It was small, white, yellowed along all 4 edges, and it had been folded once and then smoothed flat again. There was nothing written on the front. "I've kept this for 6 months, Beatrice said." Delaney looked up. "Wesley gave it to me 3 days before he died." She held the envelope with both hands. "He knocked on my door at 11 o'clock at night. He had just come home from work, still in his warehouse uniform. He didn't come in. He stood in the hallway and handed me this." She swallowed. "He said, 'Mrs. Bia, I need to ask you a favor. If one day she's about to give up, give this to her. Not before, you have to promise me. Not before." Beatrice Oduya bent down. She placed the envelope on the vinyl floor, right beside Delaney's hand. "I've been waiting 6 months to understand what giving up looks like," she said. "This morning I called you 3 times and you didn't answer. This afternoon I stood outside your door twice and you didn't come out." She straightened. "I think today is that day." Delaney Quinn looked at the envelope for a very long time. Then she picked it up. It was light. Inside there was only one sheet of paper, the squared notebook paper torn from the little notebook Wesley always kept in the breast pocket of his work jacket, and the handwriting on it was slanted, crooked, pressed a little too hard at the end of each stroke, the handwriting of a man who had never written anything longer than a grocery list. "Dell, I know you're reading this because you're wanting to stop. Don't. I didn't stay because I believed you were innocent. I stayed because I knew you were innocent. Those are 2 different things. Belief is a choice. Knowing is a fact. You keep thinking I worked 3 jobs a day because of you. I didn't. I worked 3 jobs because I couldn't stand the thought that this world could take that mind of yours and throw it into a mop bucket. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd make me drop a shift. If I don't get to see the baby, then tell the child that their mother wasn't the woman who was accused. Their mother was the woman who wrote the standard that keeps bridges from collapsing. Make sure you say it exactly like that. Don't soften it. And Dell, one more thing. If one day someone sees you, really sees you, don't turn away because of me. I'll be very angry if you do." Delaney Quinn read it to the end. She read it again from the beginning. By the 4th line, the paper had begun to tremble in her hands, and she had to hold it with both hands to keep it still. And by the final line, she couldn't read anymore, because she could no longer see the words. And then the woman who had held her back straight for 4 years, the woman who had walked 200 meters down a concrete slope into a basement every night, the woman who had sat in a room full of people and said in an even voice, "I'm the person who didn't read." That woman collapsed onto the kitchen floor and split open in two. At first she cried without sound, then with sound. She pressed the paper against her chest, folded herself over her 4-month belly, and cried in the way a person can cry only once or twice in an entire lifetime, a cry with no shape, no words, asking for nothing and demanding nothing from anyone. 4 years of holding her breath were leaving her body all at once. Beatrice Oduya didn't say a single word. She didn't say everything would be all right. She didn't say Wesley was watching from somewhere above. She had sat beside the beds of 170 people in her 31 years as a nurse, and she knew very well that there are moments when every sentence is an insult. She only walked over, braced one hand on the cabinet, lowered herself onto the vinyl floor with her 55-year-old knees, and sat down beside her. She placed one hand on the young woman's back, and she let her be. Outside, the rain was still falling. In the kitchen cabinet on the second shelf to the left, behind the salt jar, there was a box of elephant-shaped cookies that no one had touched in 4 months. And on the cold vinyl floor, a woman was crying, gripping a sheet of squared notebook paper in her hand. And for the first time since the morning with the broom in her hand, she let herself cry until there was nothing left. During those 9 nights, Rafferty Donnelly didn't send her a single word. He didn't call. He didn't have anyone bring flowers to Cedar Street, didn't send a fruit basket, didn't suggest a lunch appointment at any restaurant. Hollis Brennan walked into his office on the second day with a 3-paragraph apology letter drafted by the communications department, and Rafferty Donnelly read all 3 paragraphs, handed it back to her, and said, "Do you think she needs this?" Then he called the records department. The as-built files for the Riverside pedestrian overpass were stored in a warehouse outside Quincy, in 87 cardboard boxes stacked on steel shelves, covered in 4 years of dust. They were brought to the Keystone Tower in 2 truckloads, and they were arranged in 3 rows along the west wall of his office on the 40th floor. And the head of records asked which section he needed extracted, saying she would have someone find it. Rafferty Donnelly said there was no need. 4,200 pages. He didn't read them all. He knew from the first box that he wouldn't read them all, and not because he was lazy. He opened the first page and looked at a spreadsheet with 11 columns of data about bending moments, and he sat there for 40 minutes with his finger resting on the 3rd line, and he didn't understand a single word of it. He had left school at 16. He had learned to read cost sheets inside a container at the harbor under an oil lamp, and he could look at an invoice and know at once whether it was dishonest. But he didn't know what a bending moment was, and he never would, so he chose to read only one thing. In every as-built file for every construction project in America, at the end of every technical document, there is a small box reserved for signatures, prepared by, checked by, approved by. 3 lines, 3 names, 3 dates. Rafferty Donnelly turned one page after another, and he looked only at that box. He began at 9 o'clock on Tuesday night, and he did it for 9 straight nights, after everyone had gone home, alone, beneath the single desk lamp. He wrote on a blank sheet of paper with his ballpoint pen, Rafferty Donnelly's signature, none, not once in 4,200 pages. Fergus Donnelly's signature, none. His father had died 19 years before the first batch of concrete was poured for that bridge. Delaney Quinn's signature. He found it on the 7th night at 3:10 in the morning on page 3114. One signature. Only one. A small, even stroke, slanting slightly to the right. The same handwriting he had seen on a scrap sheet in the war room. Beneath it were the date and the time. 2:14 in the morning. Rafferty Donnelly sat looking at that signature for a very long time. Then he kept turning pages, and he began counting another name, the name that appeared on the approved by line, then on the checked by line, then in the independent certification box, then in the appendix, then in the acceptance record for each item, then in the monthly report, then in the quarterly report. He counted by making marks on the blank sheet, 5 strokes to each group. By the 9th night, a little after 4 in the morning, he set down the pen and added them up. Thaddeus Blackwood, 411 times. The most powerful man in Boston sat in the middle of a room filled with 87 cardboard boxes, and the desk lamp cast its light over the sheet of paper with 4 names and 4 numbers, and he understood that this was everything he was capable of understanding from those 4,200 pages. He had paid for 411 signatures. He had paid so some man could take a pen and write his name 411 times on sheets of paper, certifying that everything was fine. And in 8 years, he had never once sat in the same room with that man. He didn't know how tall he was. He didn't know what his voice sounded like. On the morning of the 9th day, his phone vibrated at 10:15. On the screen was a number he had saved 9 days earlier and had never pressed to call. He answered before the second ring. No one said anything for 3 seconds. Then her voice came through, hoarse, tired, but steady. "Someone told me you had 87 boxes of Riverside files brought up to the 40th floor. Yes, you read 4,000 pages? 4,200, he said. Silence. Did you understand any of it? Rafferty Donnelly looked down at the blank sheet on the desk, the sheet with 4 names on it. No, he said. He stopped for a very long time, outside the window. The city of Boston was brightening beneath a milky white November sky. But now I know the names of the 3 people who were hurt, he said. I didn't know them before. Thaddeus Blackwood heard the news on a Thursday afternoon, when an old records employee in Quincy called to ask after his health, and happened to mention that Donnelly Holdings had just had 87 boxes of Riverside files hauled downtown. He thanked the person very politely. He hung up. He sat still in his office for 12 minutes, looking out at Boston Harbor through the glass, and he did not call a lawyer, did not call Rafferty Donnelly, did not do any of the things a guilty man usually does. The next morning, one of the city's online newspapers published a 2,000-word article. No one knew who had provided the documents. No one ever would. The article was titled, "The Woman Behind the Riverside Bridge Collapse is Now Working for Donnelly Holdings," and it claimed that she was pregnant and that the public had a right to ask whether Rafferty Donnelly was spending money to keep a witness silent. Beneath the headline was a grainy long-distance photograph of a woman in a dark blue sweater walking out of the community clinic on Warren Street. In the 9th paragraph, the article named the neighborhood where she lived. It did not give the house number. It only named the street. At 5:40 the next morning, Delaney Quinn's phone vibrated on the kitchen table. "Are you awake?" Beatrice Oduya said. Her voice did not sound the way it usually did. "Bea? Don't go to the window, listen to me. There's a car parked on the street, across from the building gate, and it's been there since midnight. I got up to use the bathroom at 1 o'clock, and it was already there. It's still there now." Delaney stood up. "There are 2 people in the car," Beatrice said. "They don't get out. They don't smoke. They just sit there." She stopped. "The car has no license plate, Delaney. 4 kilometers to the north, in a penthouse apartment of a building overlooking the harbor. A man picked up after the first ring and listened for 40 seconds without saying a single word. He hung up. He rose from the edge of the bed, took the black wool coat hanging over the back of a chair, and put it on. In the car, once he had reached the avenue, Rafferty Donnelly pressed a number on his phone. Not Carney's number. Not the number of anyone who worked for Donnelly Holdings. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered, the sleepy voice of a middle-aged man. "Boston Construction Workers Union," Rafferty Donnelly said. "Local 137. Put me through to the president, 7 o'clock in the morning, Cedar Street." It was a narrow street, lined on both sides with 3-story red brick apartment buildings built in the 1940s, and at this hour the morning was still dim, with mist lying on the sidewalk. The car without a license plate was still parked there, right beneath the second streetlight, and inside the car 2 figures sat motionless. Then, at the eastern end of the street, under the yellow glow of the street lamps, streaks of orange appeared. 40 men walked toward them. They wore reflective vests, had hard hats hooked over their arms, carried plastic lunch pails, and 3 of them were arguing with one another about last night's baseball game in the thick voices of men who had been awake since 5:30. Someone was holding a paper cup of coffee. Someone was laughing as he walked. They passed the car. They did not stop. Not one of those 40 men turned his head to look through the car window. Not one of them said a single word to the 2 people sitting inside. They simply walked by, 40 people, taking up the full width of the sidewalk, their boots striking the cement. their voices echoing between the 2 rows of red brick buildings in the November morning. It took 15 minutes for the group to pass, because today their construction site was to the west, and the shortest route from the rail stop to that site did not normally pass through Cedar Street. But that morning, the president of Local 137 had called the foreman and said Mercer Street was under sewer repair, and the men should take a detour. No one asked again. The last man disappeared at the western end of the street at 7:16. 4 minutes later, the car without a license plate started its engine. It backed out of its parking space, turned at the intersection, and vanished. From the second-floor window, Delaney Quinn stood looking down at the empty street. She did not understand what had just happened. The phone in her hand vibrated. "Miss Quinn," she said nothing. "Your neighbor will open the door at 8 o'clock to go buy milk," Rafferty Donnelly said. "She can open the door." Delaney looked down at the place where the car had just been parked. On the road, only a puddle and a gum wrapper remained. "What are you doing?" she said. "Nothing. 40 men just walked past my front door. No one threatened anyone, Miss Quinn." His voice on the other end was very calm, and it was that calmness that sent a chill down her spine. 40 men are going to work. They have union cards. They're walking on a public sidewalk. They didn't say one word to anyone, and they didn't stop for 1 second. He paused. "They just happened to go to work past your home today." Delaney Quinn stood silent beside the window. "And tomorrow?" "Mercer Street still won't be finished tomorrow," Rafferty Donnelly said. And he hung up. The car without license plates did not return to Cedar Street. But 3 days later, someone else knocked on the door of another apartment, on the ground floor of a housing complex for people with disabilities in Dorchester. And that person carried a business card from a local television station. People always find the victims. That was something Thaddeus Blackwood understood better than anyone, after 40 years of sitting in rooms where people decided who would be held responsible. A story about an accused woman was vague. A story about a 28-year-old man in a wheelchair was not vague at all. The broadcast began at 6 o'clock in the evening. In the news studio on Cambridge Street, the host sat across from a young man in a plaid shirt, his hands resting on the metal rims of his wheels. Elias Ward, 28 years old. His hair was cut short, and there was a small white scar on his chin. 4 years earlier, when the scaffolding beneath the middle span of the Riverside Bridge gave way, he had been 24 years old and working the day shift to pay for night classes. On the 40th floor of the Keystone Tower, Rafferty Donnelly stood in front of the wall-mounted screen, both hands in his pockets. In the war room on the 38th floor, 14 engineers sat around the glass table, and no one touched their coffee, on Cedar Street. In the second-floor apartment, Delaney Quinn sat alone in the old armchair, and she had turned off all the lights, and the only light in the room came from the television. The host leaned forward with the expression of someone about to do a kind thing. "Mr. Ward, I know this is a difficult question, but the whole city wants to hear your answer." He moved the microphone closer. "What do you think of Delaney Quinn?" Elias Ward looked straight into the camera. He did not look at the host. He looked straight into that black lens, and he held himself there for 4 seconds, and then he spoke. "She cleaned my floors for 3 years, in the studio." A chair creaked, then silence fell. The host opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Once a month," Elias Ward said. "The first Sunday of every month. She came at 9 o'clock in the morning and left at 12 o'clock. 3 hours. He turned the wheel rim lightly under his palm. "The first time she came, she said she was a volunteer with a support program for people with disabilities, and she showed me a piece of paper, and I didn't read that paper. She didn't say her name. I didn't ask either. She cleaned the floor. She washed dishes. Once she fixed the faucet in my kitchen with a wrench she carried in her purse." He stopped. "After 4 months, I found out who she was. In the apartment on Cedar Street, Delaney Quinn sat motionless in the armchair. I looked her name up online," Elias Ward said. "I found an old photograph from when she was still working at Harrow and Vale. I sat there looking at that photograph all night," he swallowed. "And the next month, she came again. And I opened the door and let her in." The host said nothing. No one in the studio said anything. "Do you people understand what I'm saying?" Elias Ward was still looking straight into the camera, and now his voice began to change. "The woman you say took my legs from me. The person whose name you've printed in the papers for 4 years. She came and knelt on my floor once a month, and she cleaned it." He drew a breath. "And I let her do it. In the war room on the 38th floor, Margot Price raised one hand to cover her mouth. I let her kneel there, Elias Ward said, because I was angry. For the first 3 years, I was so angry I couldn't sleep. I was angry because I was 24 years old and taking night classes, and I was going to become a foreman, and then everything ended on a Tuesday afternoon, and I needed someone to be angry at. And she was there. His voice broke in the middle of the next sentence. So I sat in this chair and watched her clean my floor, and I didn't say one word of thanks for 3 years. He lifted the back of his hand to his eyes. He held it there for a moment. Then he lowered his hand. She never once asked me to forgive her, Elias Ward said. Not one time. In 3 years, she never said one sentence about it. She never cried in front of me. She never explained. She never told me it wasn't her fault. He looked into the camera. She just came and cleaned the floor. In the studio, the host sat still with the microphone in his hand. You ask me what I think of Delaney Quinn. Elias Ward placed both hands on his lap, on the 2 legs that no longer had any feeling. I think that in this entire story, she is the only person who ever walked through my door, on Cedar Street. In the dark second-floor apartment, the woman who was 4 months pregnant slid out of the armchair and sat down on the floor. She lifted both hands and covered her face. The light from the television screen trembled across her shoulders. On the 40th floor of the Keystone Tower, Rafferty Donnelly stood in front of the wall-mounted screen, and he did not move, and he could not say a single word. At 8:15 the next morning, Hollis Brennan pushed open the door to the office on the 40th floor without knocking, and she stood in the doorway with both hands clenched around her leather notebook, her face as white as paper. Rafferty. He looked up. Thaddeus Blackwood's private home in Brookline was broken into last night, around 2 in the morning. No one was home. He's in Washington. No one was hurt. Nothing was smashed. She drew a breath. A safe was taken from his study. Rafferty Donnelly set down his pen. A neighbor's camera across the street captured the plate of a small truck parked in front of the gate for 11 minutes. Hollis Brennan stepped to the desk and placed a printed sheet on it. The truck is registered under the name of a transport company in South Boston. The name on the paperwork is Seamus Donnelly. In the office, the wall clock ticked 7 times. Rafferty, Hollis Brennan said, and her voice was very slow, very clear. The voice of a lawyer speaking the things she knew would decide everything. If the prosecutor finds out that safe was obtained this way, then everything inside it is illegal evidence. And if there is any connection between that theft and this company, then everything else we present will be questioned too, including anything connected to Miss Quinn. They call it fruit of the poisonous tree. She placed both hands on the desk. Her 4 years will become nothing. The warehouse at South Boston Harbor was still the same warehouse, and it was still raining, but this time the only light still burning shone down on a gray safe set in the middle of the damp concrete floor, and beside it stood a 67-year-old man with his arms folded, wearing a velvet jacket worn thin at the elbows, his silver hair combed back. Seamus Donnelly was Fergus's younger brother. He had stood beside his brother's coffin 19 years earlier. He had taught Rafferty how to count cargo in containers when the boy was 16. You owe me a thank you, Seamus said. He tapped the back of his hand on the lid of the safe. The old bastard's whole ledger. 40 years. I didn't open it. I saved it for you. Rafferty Donnelly stood 4 steps away and looked at the safe for a very long time. He looked at it so long that Seamus began to frown. Then he took the phone from his coat pocket. Hollis, he didn't take his eyes off the safe. Seal it. Right now. Don't open it. Call a notary here. Call 2 independent witnesses. Photograph every side. Record the time. Then call Thaddeus Blackwood's lawyer and tell them to come take it back. He hung up. For 2 seconds, Seamus Donnelly didn't understand. Then he did. You're giving it back to him? His voice broke into a roar that struck the warehouse ceiling. Have you lost your mind? Everything is in this safe. 40 years of his signatures. Do you know what it cost me to get it out of that house? I'm giving it back intact. Rafferty Donnelly still didn't move. Notarized. Witnessed. No one has touched the lock. Why? Because if we open it, he said, everything inside it becomes useless in court. And so does everything she has. Seamus Donnelly stood there breathing. Then Rafferty turned to look at his uncle. And you, he said, will sit before the Suffolk County prosecutor tomorrow morning. You'll testify that you did this alone, that you're old, that you were angry, that you didn't ask anyone's permission. You'll give the names of the 2 men who went with you, and you'll hand over the truck. The warehouse went silent. "You're selling me out," Seamus said. "No," Rafferty Donnelly took one step closer. "I'm giving you a choice. Either you go yourself, or 4 years of that woman's life become worthless, and the man who signed 411 times goes home to dinner." He stopped. Outside, the rain tapped against the tin roof. "What would my father choose, Uncle Seamus?" The 67-year-old man stood there for a long time. He looked at the safe. He looked at the nephew he had taught to count cargo. Then he reached for the coat draped over a wooden crate, and he slipped his arms into it, one at a time, and he said nothing more. He walked out into the rain. The court sentenced Seamus Donnelly to 18 months. He did not appeal. He did not give any names beyond the 2 names he had promised to give. 4 days after the hearing, 3 old men in South Boston, men who had sat in the same tavern on Broadway for 40 years, sent word to Rafferty Donnelly that from now on he didn't need to step through that door again. The Port Workers Union held an emergency meeting on Friday night. Donnelly Holdings' 31-year stevedoring contract was not renewed. 3 generations, his grandfather, his father, and him, all gone in one night. Hollis Brennan brought the final report up to the 40th floor and placed it on his desk, and she said nothing at all. And Rafferty Donnelly read it and gave one nod and told her to go home and rest. 3 weeks later, his secretary brought up an envelope, no stamp, no return address, only his name handwritten on the front in blue ink in the trembling script of a very old person. There was no letter inside. Inside, there was only a small black and white photograph with curled edges. In the photograph was a winter cemetery. There was a coffin covered with a flag. There was a woman standing with her head bowed in a black coat too large for her body, and beside her stood a 15-year-old boy in a borrowed suit, too thin, his hands clasped tightly in front of his stomach, his eyes lowered to the ground. Standing behind that boy were 3 men. Each had one hand resting on his shoulder. Rafferty Donnelly turned the photograph over. On the back, written in that same blue ink, in that same trembling hand, were the words, "We used to stand behind you." The most powerful man in Boston sat in his office and looked at that photograph for a very long time. He didn't call anyone. He didn't break anything. Then he opened the bottom drawer on the left, placed the photograph inside it, face down, and closed the drawer. He didn't tell anyone about this, not even her. A little after midnight, there was a knock at the door of the 2nd-floor apartment on Cedar Street. Not hard. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, then nothing. Delaney Quinn set down her book and went out. She looked through the peephole and stood still for a while. Then she unlocked the door. Rafferty Donnelly stood in the hallway. He wasn't wearing a coat. His white shirt was soaked through at both shoulders and clinging to his arms, and water ran from his hair down his temples, and his shoes left 2 dark marks on the tile floor. He didn't say anything. He only stood there. Delaney looked at him for a very long time. She didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't ask how long he had been standing in the rain. Then she stepped back once, and she opened the door wider. He didn't step inside. He turned around, walked to the concrete steps leading down to the backyard, and sat on the top step, both elbows braced on his knees. The rain was still falling, light and slanting. Delaney Quinn stood in the doorway for a while. Then she pulled her sweater around herself, stepped out, and sat down beside him on the wet step. 4 months pregnant, a little after 1 in the morning, beneath the dim yellow hallway light. No one said a single word. 20 minutes passed. Across the yard there was a tire swing hanging from a tree branch, and it rocked very softly in the wind, and water dripped from it into the mud puddle below, 1 drop at a time. Delaney Quinn sat looking at that swing. In 4 years she hadn't sat beside a man without having to explain who she was, without having to say her name, without having to say what she used to do for a living, without having to say it wasn't my fault or yes, it was my fault, depending on which article the man had read. She only sat. Then he spoke. His voice was very quiet, and it sounded as though it wasn't meant for her, but had only happened to be spoken while she was there. "I just lost everything my father left me." Delaney Quinn didn't turn her head. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what he had lost, to whom, or how. She looked down at her hand resting on her knee, and she said, "I know what that feels like." And they sat there in silence, 2 people on a wet step, until the eastern sky turned gray. 3 days later, at 12:40 in the afternoon, 7 people sat in the small conference room on the 40th floor. Hollis Brennan sat on the left. On the right was a salt and pepper-haired notary public named Gerald Fitch, who had set a stopwatch on the table and was recording every movement in the minutes. Margot Price stood with her back against the wall. Rafferty Donnelly stood in the corner of the room, both hands in his pockets, and he had not said a word for 20 minutes. In the middle of the table was a laptop that had been disconnected from the internal network and connected directly to a private line. "Miss Quinn," Gerald Fitch said, "please describe it for the record." Delaney Quinn cleared her throat. "4 years ago, when I was the lead inspection officer on the Riverside Pedestrian Overpass project, I installed an independent vibration sensor system on the 4 main spans. 28 measuring points. It was not in the contract, no one approved it. I paid for the equipment myself out of my salary. Why? Because I'm paranoid," she said. "Because I grew up with a mother who fell on a stair step. Someone had already reported as broken. No one in the room moved. The data from that sensor system did not go into the company server. It went straight to a third-party cold storage service, registered under my name, paid monthly with my personal bank card. $18 a month." She placed both hands on the edge of the table. "I have never logged into it since the day the bridge collapsed." "Not once?" Hollis Brennan asked. "Not once." She looked down at the keyboard. "As long as I hadn't looked, it was still there." Gerald Fitch pressed the stopwatch. "Please proceed." Delaney Quinn placed her fingers on the keyboard. She typed the website address. She typed the username. Then she typed the password, and at the 6th character her hand trembled so hard that she mistyped, and the screen reported an error. She typed again, wrong the 2nd time. Margot Price stepped forward as if to place a hand on her shoulder, then stopped halfway. "Take your time," Hollis Brennan said softly. "No one is rushing." Delaney drew in a very long breath. She typed the 3rd time, 1 key at a time, slowly. The screen changed, the account opened. For 4 seconds, the status bar ran across the screen while the system loaded the storage directory index. Then it stopped. No one said anything. On the screen was a white box. The index showed a single line, written in pale gray letters at the center. "There are no files in this folder." In the lower right corner, under the most recent activity log, there was a timestamp. "All contents deleted 2 days ago. 11 o'clock at night." Gerald Fitch stopped writing. Hollis Brennan rose from her chair very slowly, and she leaned down to look at the screen, and she read that line twice. "Someone knew before we did," she said. "Impossible." Margot Price moved closer to the table, her face bloodless. "Impossible. That was everything. That was everything." She did not finish the sentence. In the conference room on the 40th floor, Rafferty Donnelly took 1 step out of the corner and stopped. Delaney Quinn sat very still in front of the computer. She did not cry. She did not raise a hand to her face. She only looked at the white box on the screen for about 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds something passed across her face that no one in the room could read. Then she said, very softly, "It's all right." No one heard her clearly. "What did you say?" Hollis Brennan asked. Delaney Quinn pushed the laptop aside. She reached for the faded leather wallet sitting on the chair beside her, and she opened it. And from the innermost compartment, she took out a small black and white photograph. Its edges curled from being folded and unfolded too many times. She placed it on the wooden table in front of everyone. Rafferty Donnelly looked at the photograph and understood at once what it was, and he thought he knew whose image it was. He was wrong. "This is not the baby now," Delaney said. The room stopped. 6 weeks after the bridge collapsed, I lost my first baby. She said that sentence in the same even voice she used for things that could not be spoken of. I have carried this photograph in my wallet for 4 years. Wesley knew. No one else knew. She picked up the photograph. She turned it over, slipped her fingernail into one corner, and peeled away the cardboard backing very carefully, along a line that had clearly been peeled back and sealed again once, a long time ago. Inside, tucked between the 2 layers of paper, was a memory card no bigger than the nail of a little finger. Margot Price has covered her mouth. 3 weeks before he died, Delaney Quinn said, Wesley told me not to keep it at home. He said that if people wanted to find it, they would search the house, the bank, the hard drive, the mailbox. He told me to keep it somewhere I would never leave behind, and somewhere no one would think to open. She placed the memory card on the wooden table, right beside the photograph. It lay there, tiny and black. 4 years, she said. I slept with it under my pillow. I cleaned floors with it in my breast pocket. I carried it onto buses, into clinics, past 311 cameras in this building. Every night, she lifted her head and looked at Rafferty Donnelly. And I have never once dared to look at it. The reinspection was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. and the city safety board went up to the 32nd floor in the construction elevator. 6 people with leather briefcases and white hard hats. With them, as required, was the representative of the independent inspection firm that had signed the acceptance certificate for the damper system. Thaddeus Blackwood was 61 years old, with neatly combed silver hair, wearing a fleece jacket, and he stepped out of the elevator with the smile of a grandfather visiting his grandchildren. He saw Delaney Quinn standing at the edge of the concrete floor. His smile did not move. Not one muscle on that face shifted, not his eyes, not the corners of his mouth, not a single wrinkle. It stayed there, perfect, for 2 full seconds. Then he turned and shook the lead inspector's hand. On the 32nd floor, the wind had changed from the night before. A low-pressure system from off Nantucket was pushing into the east coast, and the morning report said gusts could reach 70 kilometers an hour before noon. Sullivan Reeves stood beside the measuring board with a tablet in his hand, and he glanced at the number displayed there, then looked a second time. 60. The head of the board set his briefcase on the folding table and opened it. Someone poured coffee into a paper cup. 68. The nearest steel column gave off a very low, long hum, like a plucked string. 74. The tower began to vibrate. It did not sway. It vibrated, a small, steady movement, and the surface of the coffee in the paper cup rippled into concentric circles running toward the rim, and a pen rolled off the folding table, and one member of the board cried out and stumbled backward toward the elevator. The folding table slid 2 centimeters across the concrete floor. Delaney Quinn did not look at the building. She walked straight to the electrical control cabinet for the damper system mounted on column number 4, opened the cover, and looked at the 2 rows of indicator lights inside for exactly 3 seconds. Unit number 2 is out of phase, she said. Her voice cut through the wind. It's pushing in the same direction. The transport lock pin hasn't been removed. Sullivan Reeves spun around. What? Mechanical chamber on the 40th floor, west compartment. The pin is still intact in there. The weight isn't moving. It's been welded rigid to the frame. Margot Price was already running toward the elevator, and Thaddeus Blackwood stepped out and blocked the way. No one is to touch equipment that has not yet been re-inspected, he said. His voice was still warm, still calm, still the voice of a man who had sat in 400 meetings and had never once raised it in any of them. Miss Price, you are present at a city inspection. Any intervention in the system at this moment will invalidate the entire procedure, and I will have to note in the record that. Rafferty Donnelly said nothing. He stepped forward. He took 3 steps and stopped in front of Thaddeus Blackwood, about a handspan away, and he did not raise his hand, did not touch him, did not open his mouth. He only looked. 9 seconds. During those 9 seconds, no one on the 32nd floor made a sound except for the wind. Thaddeus Blackwood looked into the face of the man standing before him, and he saw there something 40 years in air-conditioned rooms had not prepared him for. He stepped back. Margot Price rushed into the elevator. Delaney Quinn turned and walked toward the mechanical chamber door at column number 6, the steel door leading into the service shaft that ran up to the 40th floor. Rafferty Donnelly stopped her. You're 4 months pregnant, I know. Her voice broke between the 2 words. I know very well. She lifted her eyes to him, and her eyes were red, and the wind tore her hair loose from its tie. 4 years ago I was pregnant too, and I sat still in that container at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I signed that paper, and 3 weeks later 3 men fell, and 6 weeks later I couldn't keep my baby. She gripped the steel handle. I won't sit still one more time. Rafferty Donnelly looked at her for a long time. Then he lifted his hands, took the black wool coat off his shoulders, and threw it onto the damp concrete floor. Then guide me through the radio, he said. The service shaft was 90 centimeters high and as dark as a mine. Rafferty Donnelly, the most powerful man in Boston, crawled through it on his knees and elbows, a flashlight clenched between his teeth, the radio earpiece tucked in his right ear, while the 45-story tower vibrated beneath his palms. You're at the bend, her voice said in his ear. Past that, on your left, there'll be a steel cover with 6 bolts, he crawled on. Iron dust and machine grease, the long hum of steel overhead. I see it. Remove the cover, reverse thread bolts. Turn clockwise to open, he did it. Inside, there's a yellow support frame. On the frame are 3 transport pins. Those are the steel rods they fasten in so the weight doesn't shift when it's being hoisted. They were supposed to be removed on installation day. The flashlight swept across the yellow steel frame. 3 pins were lying there, their paint still new, without a single scratch. "They're still here," he said. Below, someone said over the radio that the wind had just reached 81. "Listen to me," Delaney Quinn said. Her voice was very calm. "Third bolt from the left, only the third one. Turn counterclockwise. Don't touch the other 2. How long? You have 10 seconds before the next vibration cycle." Rafferty Donnelly set the wrench in place. He turned. 7, 6, 5. The thread was stiff. He drove his whole shoulder into it. 3, 2. The pin sprang out of the hole and fell to the floor of the service shaft with a metallic clink, and above his head, 300 tons of steel suddenly became free. On the 32nd floor, Sullivan Reeves looked at the amplitude number on the tablet, and he did not breathe. It dropped. Dropped again. Then it flattened. The tower stood still. In that silence, no one applauded. The mechanical chamber door opened, and a man nearly 6'3" crawled out, his white shirt torn at one elbow, both hands black with machine oil, his hair caked with iron dust. He straightened, and the first thing he did was not look at his tower. He looked at her. The wind was still howling through the bare steel frame, but the tower stood still, and in that sudden stillness, Thaddeus Blackwood was the first to speak. "This is an unfortunate technical incident," he said to the head of the board, and he was still smiling, and he held out both hands in the manner of a man trying to reassure a child. "Clearly there was an error during the subcontractor's installation process. My firm will open a comprehensive review and—" "Mr. Fitch," Hollis Brennan said. The salt-and-pepper-haired notary stepped forward from behind them. He was carrying a laptop sealed with marked tape, and he placed it on the folding table in the middle of the concrete floor. Delaney Quinn took the black memory card from her pocket. She handed it to Hollis Brennan, and Hollis Brennan handed it to the notary, and Gerald Fitch recorded the time in the minutes, and he plugged it in. There were 11 files on it. They were numbered by date. "Please look at the 4th chart," Delaney said. "This is vibration data from 28 measuring points across the 4 main spans of the Riverside pedestrian overpass. The left column is the date." A line appeared on the screen. The 6 members of the board leaned down. Sullivan Reeves looked at it for 3 seconds, then raised a hand to his mouth. "Solid steel and hollow core steel do not vibrate the same way," Delaney said. "Never. A hollow bar has less mass but nearly the same stiffness, so its natural frequency is higher, 4.7%. It's right there on this line, at 11 measuring points, repeated every hour, every day." She placed her finger on the screen. "This date is March 14th. She moved her finger to the right, to a vertical marker Gerald Fitch had already marked. "And this is the day I signed the material approval." April 5th, on the 32nd floor, no one breathed. 3 weeks, Delaney Quinn said. "The hollow steel had been in the middle span of that bridge for 3 weeks before I ever picked up a pen." The head of the board looked up. "You're saying that? I'm saying I signed a paper that lied," she said. "I did not lie." She turned, and she looked straight at the silver-haired man in the fleece jacket, the man who had come to her wedding, the man she had called uncle for 7 years. For 4 years, Delaney Quinn had built hundreds of versions of this moment inside her mind. In every one of them, she screamed. She did not scream. "You're not a monster, Uncle Thad," she said. The whole 32nd floor fell silent. "You're just a tired man who signed a piece of paper." She spoke very softly. 411 times in that file. You were right 410 times. You signed from an office, based on other people's reports, the way everyone in this industry has done for 40 years. And you were right so often that you stopped reading. She drew a breath. "Just like I did." Thaddeus Blackwood did not move. "The only difference between you and me," Delaney Quinn said, "is that when that bridge collapsed, you had a name to give them." She looked at him, and I didn't. The smile on Thaddeus Blackwood's face finally left. It did not collapse. It slipped away very slowly, little by little, like snow sliding off a roof, and underneath it there was nothing at all. "Delaney," he said, "you have to understand that in this industry," and Delaney Quinn said, 4 years ago, in that construction site container, you said one sentence to me." He stopped. "You don't remember. You said it, then you walked out of the room." I sat there alone and watched the door close. She stood very straight. 15 years ago, a lawyer in a suit said that exact sentence to my mother, in the living room of our home in Lowell, when she could no longer rise from her chair. On the 32nd floor, the wind had gone still. "These things still happen," she said. In the corner of the concrete floor, 8 steps away, The man standing there with both hands black with machine oil turned his head. He turned very slowly. In 19 years, Rafferty Donnelly had never spoken those 8 words to anyone except Cormac Vale in a dark warehouse. He had heard them for the first time when he was 15 years old, standing in a borrowed suit beside his mother, before a flag-draped coffin, from the mouth of a man holding a leather briefcase. He looked at Delaney Quinn. She did not look back. She was still looking at Thaddeus Blackwood. The head of the city safety board rose from the folding chair. He looked around the concrete floor, from the woman in the dark blue sweater, to the sealed laptop, to the notary recording the minutes. "Excuse me," he said. "Who just said that sentence?" And Rafferty Donnelly. Standing among his 14 engineers, 6 members of the city board, and the man who had signed the safety certificate for his $400 million tower, answered, "Her name is Delaney Quinn." He did not raise his voice. "She wrote the standard you are using to grade me, 1123. The construction elevator opened. 2 people in dark suits and a woman carrying a folder stepped out, and the woman raised her badge and said she worked for the Suffolk County Prosecutor's Office, and that she had a few questions for Mr. Thaddeus Blackwood." He said nothing. He took off his hard hat, set it on the folding table very neatly, and followed them into the elevator. That afternoon, in the honey-colored stone hallway on the 40th floor, a man walked down the row of oak frames and stopped in front of the 17th frame. He lifted it off the hook with 2 hands still stained with machine oil. He did not smash it. He simply turned it around and leaned it face down against the wall. Delaney Quinn was not there to see it. She was sitting on a plastic chair at the Warren Street Community Clinic, waiting for her 18th week checkup. Months passed. Thaddeus Blackwood's case was transferred to federal court in February. Delaney Quinn's professional license was restored on March 19th, in a 2-paragraph letter sent through the mail, with no apology in it. She read it in the kitchen, folded it, and put it in the drawer with the electric bill. On the night of April 7th, at 11:40, Beatrice Oduya knocked on her neighbor's door with both fists and called a taxi. Rafferty Donnelly arrived at Brigham Hospital at 12:18 in the morning. He asked no one anything. He walked straight to the hallway on the 4th floor, the maternity ward, and stopped about 4 steps from the white double doors, both hands hanging at his sides. Kearney arrived 15 minutes after him, carrying the coat he had left behind on the car seat. He did not put it on. A hospital hallway at 1 o'clock in the morning had the color of watered-down milk. There were 14 blue plastic chairs lined along the wall. There was a vending machine humming in the corner. There was a nurse walking back and forth, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. Kearney sat down in the 3rd chair. Rafferty Donnelly did not sit. In the 2nd hour, Kearney bought 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine and set one on the windowsill beside where he stood. It went cold there. In the 4th hour, the cry of a baby came from another room at the end of the hallway, and a young man ran out and wrapped his arms around his mother, and both of them laughed, and they disappeared toward the elevator, and the hallway fell silent again. Rafferty Donnelly still stood. In the 5th hour, Kearney got up. He was 40 years old and had driven for the Donnelly family for 11 years, and he had never said one sentence to his boss that wasn't related to work. "Boss," he said softly, "you should sit." Rafferty Donnelly did not turn his head. "I don't sit in hospitals." Kearney waited. He meant to say something about his back, about 19 hours on his feet, then he stopped. The silence lasted for a very long time, so long that Kearney had already sat back down and thought the conversation was over. Then Rafferty Donnelly said, "My mother died in a hallway like this." Kearney looked up. "I was 19. She was inside for 4 days. On the 4th night, I sat down in a blue plastic chair exactly like the one you're sitting in." He looked straight at the white double doors. "I dozed off. The vending machine hummed in the corner of the hallway, and when I woke up, she was gone." Kearney said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I don't sit anymore," Rafferty Donnelly said. At 3:12 in the morning, the double doors opened. A nurse stepped out, her mask pulled down beneath her chin, her face shiny with sweat but smiling. She looked around the hallway, saw the tall man standing there, and walked over. "Are you her husband?" "No." The nurse tilted her head, pencil hovering over the paper. "What are you to her?" Rafferty Donnelly looked at the delivery room door for a long time. He stood there, his shirt wrinkled, 19 hours without sleep, both hands washed clean of machine oil from 4 months ago, but still carrying a dark stain beneath his thumbnail that he had never managed to scrub away completely. "I don't know," he said. The nurse looked at him for one more second. Then she wrote something on the paper and said that mother and baby were safe, that the baby weighed 3.2 kilograms, and that the mother was awake and alert. Inside that room, a baby girl had been born at 3:04 in the morning on April 8th. Delaney Quinn lay on her side in the bed, her hair stuck to her forehead, and she looked at the tiny sleeping face wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, and she told the midwife her daughter's name for the birth certificate, Wren Wesley Quinn. Beatrice Oduya sat in the chair beside the bed, both hands clasped together, and she cried without making a sound, and she did not wipe her face. 40 minutes later, Delaney said something to the nurse. The nurse stepped out into the hallway. The door opened. Rafferty Donnelly walked to the threshold and stopped there. He did not come in. He stood right on the line between the hallway tile and the tile inside the room, 1 foot ahead of the other, and he could not move any farther. The man who had destroyed a contractor with one sentence, the man who had returned a safe to his enemy, the man who had crawled through a dark service shaft while 45 floors of steel vibrated above his head, stood in the doorway of a delivery room and did not dare take one more step. On the bed, Delaney Quinn lifted her head. She looked at him, and she said, "Come in, Rafferty." It was the first time she had called him by his name. An hour later, the hospital room had only one small light above the bed. Beatrice had gone home to get some things. The baby was sleeping in the plastic bassinet beside the bed, both tiny hands loosely curled beside her cheeks. Rafferty Donnelly sat in the chair he had refused to sit in for 19 hours, both elbows braced on his knees, and he asked her whether she wanted anything to eat. Delaney Quinn looked up at the ceiling for a very long time. She thought for so long that he believed she had fallen asleep. Then she said, "Elephant-shaped cookies." He did not understand. He did not ask her to explain. He stood, took the coat draped over the back of the chair, and walked out. At 4 o'clock in the morning in Boston, in April, not many bakeries were open. The first on Huntington was closed. The second sold only bread. At the third, the clerk said they had stopped making animal-shaped ones since winter. At the fourth, a small shop on the corner of Tremont that had just started its ovens a little before 4 o'clock. An old woman with silver hair looked at the man nearly 6'3" standing there in a black wool coat and said she had butter cookies, and she had an elephant-shaped cutter, and if he could wait 20 minutes, she would bake him a batch. He waited 20 minutes. He paid $7. When he came back to the hospital room, dawn had begun to rise behind the rooftops. Delaney Quinn took the brown paper bag from his hand. She opened it. She picked up one cookie, looked at it, and lifted it to her mouth and took a bite. It was her first bite of that kind of cookie in 4 years, and that woman cried, not the kind of crying that had broken out of her on the vinyl kitchen floor. This was something different, quieter, almost soundless, and she was still holding the cookie in her hand, and tears ran down her chin and fell onto the hospital blanket. Rafferty Donnelly did not ask why. He only sat down in the chair beside the bed, and he stayed there until the morning was fully bright. 1 year later, the Keystone Tower held its grand opening. 800 people packed the great lobby beneath the crystal lights. At 9 o'clock that night, Delaney Quinn slipped away from the crowd, took the elevator down to the basement parking level, and walked along the concrete slope she had walked for 700 nights of her life, this time in a midnight blue evening dress and with her shoes in her hand. Behind the glass counter, beneath the fluorescent light, a 64-year-old man lifted his head from the book he was reading. "Good evening, Miss Quinn." "Good evening, Mr. Otis." She walked around the counter and sat down on the plastic chair beside him, and he pushed his cold lunchbox toward her, and she finished what was left with his plastic fork, the way she had on so many old nights. In the corner of the basement, beneath the fire escape stairs, her old cleaning cart still stood there, covered in dust, one rear wheel broken. On top of the cart, in the place where the glass cleaner bottle used to sit, someone had placed a metal mechanical pencil with all its paint worn away. There was no card. Otis Flanagan said nothing at all. He only smiled and opened the lid of the lunchbox. Upstairs on the ground floor, Rafferty Donnelly stood before 800 people and said that someone had just asked him what kept this tower standing. "Not steel," he said. "Anyone can buy steel. It stands because at 3:17 in the morning, a woman who was 4 months pregnant, who should have been home asleep, sat down at a table, and did a thing no one was paying her to do. He stopped for a very long time. In the 2 years before that night, he said, "I walked past her 100 times and never once looked. I once said into a phone, 'Move the cleaning woman away.'" He looked down at 800 faces. "I used to think power meant knowing everything that happened inside my building. It doesn't. Power is only a signboard that tells us who we are allowed not to see." They took her name from her. They took her license, her work, the doors that should have opened for her. And in the end, they took the man she loved. But there was one thing they could never touch. The thing inside her that would not allow her to stand still and watch a structure about to break without speaking. That thing was never the uniform. That thing was the person. And that person stood there for all those years, right in front of everyone, waiting for someone to finally look. Now, they see her. This story leaves us with one very simple thing, that the safety of all of us is built by people whose names we never know. That signing a piece of paper is easy, while reading it is hard, and the distance between those two things is sometimes an entire human life. And that every time we walk past someone without truly seeing them, we are removing one screw from the very building we are standing inside. Look at the person cleaning your floor. Remember the name of the person holding the door for you. Kindness does not have to be grand. It only needs to be seen. If this story has touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so you can hear more compelling stories every day. We would love to know how you feel about Delaney Quinn's story. Please leave a comment below and tell us what stayed in your heart, because every word you share is heard and treasured by us. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in